Armageddon was dying beneath a sky the color of old bruises. Major Ren Varric watched the ash wastes vanish behind the armored vision block of his chimera as the transport hammered eastward at a speed that made its tracks shriek against the poisoned earth. The sealed troop compartment stank of hot metal, weapon oil, old sweat trapped inside rebreather masks, and the sour chemical breath of men who had been fighting too long inside the same armor. Beyond the hull, where no sane man lingered without filtration, kilometers of wreckage marked the retreat toward Hive death mire. Chimeras burned with their rear ramps open, the corpses of Steel Legion infantry hanging half out of them where they had died trying to escape. Lehman Russ battle tanks sat gutted beside the roadway, turret rings blackened, tracks unspooled like flayed tendons. Farther west, an entire mechanized regiment had disappeared beneath a continent of ash raised by thousands of engines, and through that ochre murk came the sound the men of Armageddon had learned to fear more than artillery. Engines screaming far beyond safe tolerances, rising and falling in savage chorus, heard several heartbeats before the machines themselves appeared. "Speed freaks," Sergeant Cord muttered over the squad vox, his voice compressed to a metallic rasp inside Varric's headset. The major did not answer. He had already seen them on the Auspex, erratic green contacts flickering across the tactical display, too fast and too numerous for the cogitator to track cleanly. Ahead, the remains of the western rearguard were trying to form a blocking line around a junction of cracked ferrocrete causeways. 3 chimeras slewed broadside, presenting multi-lasers toward the approaching dust storm, while infantry remained mounted until the last possible moment. Behind them, Lehman Russes reversed into hull-down firing positions among the wrecked shells of Manufactorum haulers. Someone had prepared the ground well. Someone else had arrived too late. A low note rolled across the wastes, deep enough to vibrate through the Chimera's armor, and then the horizon vomited orcs. Warbikes burst from the dust first, dozens becoming hundreds, hundreds becoming more shapes than Varric could distinguish. Their machines were crude agglomerations of iron, armor plate, exhaust stacks, and impossible engines, every one of them belching smoke and incandescent sparks. Some mounted enormous guns above their handlebars. Others had blades welded along the frames, spinning saws beneath the forks or trophies wired to their cowling. Buggies followed, fishtailing through craters, while gunners fired wildly from exposed platforms. Defcopters came above them, rotors chopping toxic air as rockets corkscrewed toward the Imperial line. The first salvo struck short. The second did not. A chimera vanished beneath a blossom of flame, its roof plate thrown 30 meters into the air, with a guardsman still clinging to the pintle mount. Another rocket slammed into a Lehman Russ's track assembly and rolled the tank half around before its commander could correct. The crew kept firing. The battle cannon spoke once, and an orc buggy disappeared along with 6 bikes unfortunate enough to be alongside it. Then something red came through the smoke faster than anything that size had a right to move. Big Reva hit the battlefield like a shell fired from an artillery piece. The warbike was an obscene monument to orcish engineering, more engine than chassis, armor plates hammered around an overpowered heart that screamed like a tortured beast. Ghazghkull rode it upright and laughing, his immense body leaning into the acceleration while the Psycho Gatler mounted to the machine opened fire. The weapon did not chatter like an Imperial autocannon. It howled. A storm of ammunition crossed the junction and found an infantry section dismounting from cover. Men burst apart. Flak armor cracked. Torsos became wet fragments slapped across the chimera behind them. One guardsman lost his head and both arms before the rest of his body realized it had died, remaining upright for an instant beneath the impact before collapsing into the churned ash. Ghazghkull roared something unintelligible over his engine, then bellowed louder when a heavy bolter stitched explosions across the ground in front of him. "That all you got, Humies? Faster! Shoot faster!" The immobilized Lehman Russ directly ahead of him fired its Lascannon. The beam passed. Beneath Big Reva, as Ghazghkull hauled the bike sideways, tires throwing black earth. He did not slow. The Russ's ruined track assembly had left the tank canted against a crater lip, presenting the sloped glacis like a ramp. Ghazghkull aimed straight for it. Big Reva struck the armor plate hard enough to shower sparks over the command cupola, climbed the burning tank, and launched into open air. For a moment the Orc and his machine hung above the battlefield, with tracer fire passing beneath them. Then they came down behind the Imperial line. Big Reva crushed one officer under its rear wheel and ploughed through another man before Ghazghkull hauled it around. The Psycho Gatler opened again at almost touching distance. The command platoon ceased to exist as an organized formation. Ghazghkull threw back his head and laughed, while blood steamed on his engine casing. "Now that's racing," Varric keyed the command net. "Column, disperse by sections. Do not stop on the causeway. Second platoon, dismount behind the refinery berm. Melter gunners hold until the wagons commit. Russ section, fire by troop. Vox, signal the basilisks. Grid mark Helios 9, danger close." His driver glanced toward him through the interior vision slit, but Varric had already turned away. Steel Legion did not meet Orcs on open ground because somebody wanted a heroic firing line for a propagandist's pict reel. Armageddon had cured its soldiers of that stupidity generations ago. Chimeras spread into the ruins on either side of the roadway, tracks crushing masonry as multilacers swept across the oncoming bikes. Infantry stayed inside their sealed hulls until the transports reached defensible ground. Then rear ramps dropped and squads spilled into firing positions under cover of hull-mounted heavy bolters. Laser guns fired from windows, collapsed loading bays, and the shadows beneath ruptured pipelines. The first Orc wave hit disciplined fire and came apart in sections. Green bodies tumbled from bikes. Engines cartwheeled through following mobs. A Nob took 3 las bolts through the chest, lost half his jaw to a 4th, and still managed to ram his bike into the position that had killed him. "Battle wagons," someone shouted across the Vox. Varric saw them through the dust, gigantic slab-sided vehicles packed with boys, their armor painted with clan glyphs and crude red chevrons. "Hold, Melter," he ordered. "Hold! Hold!" The first wagon smashed through the wreckage of 2 bikes and continued straight toward the refinery berm. Heavy bolter rounds sparked uselessly from its frontal plate. 30 meters. 20. The melter gunners rose from concealment. "Now!" White heat washed over the Orc vehicle. Armor ran like wax. The battle wagon's forward compartment collapsed inward, engine fuel igniting a heartbeat later. The blast lifted the entire front end from the ground and hurled burning boys from its open deck. Some were dead before they landed. Others hit the earth ablaze and kept running. Steel Legion laser guns chopped them apart in disciplined volleys, each section leader calling targets instead of allowing men to fire at whatever frightened them most. The basilisks answered Varric's request. Their shells came from kilometers away with the drawn-out shriek of approaching damnation. The first impacts fell behind the bike mobs and threw pillars of ash hundreds of meters into the sky. The second walked forward. Earth erupted beneath warbikers. Machines vanished. Bodies turned end over end through dust stained dark with pulverized flesh. The third salvo landed so near the Imperial line that Varric's Chimera rocked on its suspension and fragments hammered against the hull like handfuls of thrown nails. He imagined the Basilisk crews far to the east, stripped to undershirts inside steaming gun pits, loading shell after shell into weapons whose barrels would already be hot enough to sear flesh from an ungloved hand. They would keep firing until ordered to cease, or until the guns split. On Armageddon, those were often the same thing. The Orcs kept coming. A rocket struck Lieutenant Dresch's Chimera beneath the right side firing port. The shaped charge punched through armor, carrying molten metal and fragments of the vehicle's own hull into the troop compartment. The internal Vox captured the first second of it. Varric heard a flat concussion, then screaming. Dresch's men had been packed shoulder to shoulder. There was nowhere for... the blast to go except through them. Shards of plasteel tore open bellies and faces. A guardsman nearest the penetration point was cut almost in half, his upper body thrown across 3 others, while his intestines slapped steaming against the opposite bench. Another man's rebreather mask fused into what remained of his mouth. Ammunition cooked off inside a belt pouch and punched red holes through 2 soldiers trapped beside him. The rear ramp dropped with a hydraulic scream, and survivors crawled out through smoke, carrying burning pieces of their comrades on their coats. They emerged directly beneath an orc charge. Boys came through the haze with choppers raised, huge bodies pounding across the ash. A steel legionnaire fired from his knees until an orc took 3 las bolts through the abdomen, kept coming, and buried a chopper in the man's collarbone. The blade split flak armor, shoulder and ribs, before lodging near the spine. Another guardsman thrust a bayonet into an orc's throat and was rewarded with a headbutt that collapsed the front of his skull. Heavy bolter fire from Varric's transport tore into the mob. One orc lost an arm and half its torso, the mass-reactive shells bursting meat outward in green-red sprays. Another was struck in the pelvis and folded around the detonation before being thrown backward. Gunnar Halbrecht remained behind his weapon after an orc round took both his legs below the knee. Blood filled the footwell beneath him. He tied one tourniquet badly, abandoned the second when another mob appeared, and continued firing until the heavy bolter's barrel smoked. "Still got me hands, Major," he snarled when a corpsman tried to drag him away. "Leave the bloody gun." Varric left him there. There were no spare chimeras, no spare crews, and increasingly few spare men. A damaged vehicle that could move was ordered east. A damaged vehicle that could not was stripped of ammunition and destroyed if recovery was impossible. Immobilized armor attracted orcs the way carrion drew corpse flies. Varric watched a crippled chimera remain stationary for less than 3 minutes before bikes circled it, peppering the firing ports while boys clambered onto the roof. The crew detonated their own fuel before the orcs opened the hatch. Flame rolled 20 meters high. The warbikers around it cheered. Then the command vox changed. The panicked overlap of retreating officers disappeared beneath a single voice ordering traffic priorities on the Eastern Road network. Armor was redirected. Artillery grids altered. Reserve companies that had been moving toward Deathmire were turned south without explanation. Varric knew the voice before the identification rune appeared on his display. Every soldier on Armageddon did. "Major Varric, your column will hold Junction Cerberus for 11 minutes. Varric looked at the tactical screen. Cerberus was a shattered crossing less than 4 kilometers ahead. 3 roads met there. If the orcs took it intact, they could pour armor toward the northern refugee corridors. "Commissar Yarrick, my column is below half fighting strength." "I know. There are speed freaks on our western flank, and at least 2 heavy mobs closing from the south." "I know that as well." Varric waited for something more. None came. Yarrick did not explain the obvious to officers entrusted with men and tanks. "Understood. 11 minutes. 10 now." The channel closed. Yarrick arrived at Cerberus before Varric did. There was no parade, no standard held against the smoke, and no circle of adjutants announcing the hero of Armageddon. An unmarked command chimera stopped behind the junction, while men were still dragging ammunition crates from a burning supply carrier. Yarrick emerged beneath the toxic sky in his greatcoat and rebreather gear, moving with the rigid economy of a body that had been broken, rebuilt, and then ordered back to war before either flesh or machine considered itself ready. His famous power claw hung like an executioner's tool at one side. The bionic eye that had become legend among the orcs burned beneath his cap. Officers straightened without being told. Men who had been drifting toward the rear suddenly discovered reasons to remain beside their weapons. Yarrick looked once at the ground and began spending lives. Those Russes across the southern approach. Park them hull down and abandon them when the ammunition is gone. Third Chimera. Troop blocks the western road. Mine the vehicles before withdrawal. Artillery shifts 200 meters west. An artillery lieutenant stared at him. Sir, that will put the barrage on our outer positions. Yarek's mechanical eye settled upon him. Yes. The lieutenant swallowed. Understood. Yarek turned to Varric. You will withdraw through the refinery culvert when the second barrage lands, not before. Varric nodded toward the horizon, where Orc engines were already rising again. And if the culvert is lost? Yarek's expression did not change. Then you will have discovered why I ordered the armor placed on the southern approach. The next 10 minutes killed nearly everyone defending Cerberus. Warbikes hit first, then battle wagons, then mobs on foot so dense the ash beneath them disappeared. The abandoned Ruses fired until their ammunition racks were almost empty. Then their surviving crews crawled through escape hatches and ran east, while demolition charges armed behind them. Steel Legion chimeras reversed from position to position, multi-lacers flickering through dust as dismounted infantry leapfrogged between cover. Basilisk shells landed among friend and foe alike. Orcs vanished inside explosions. Guardsmen were crushed by collapsing ferrocrete. A Nob reached the western barricade with half his face burned away and killed 4 men before a Meltagun turned his chest cavity into incandescent vapor. Varric lost 2 more chimeras and stopped counting infantry casualties when the Vox became too crowded with requests for medici teams that no longer existed. Then the second barrage came down, and Cerberus ceased being a junction. The Steel Legion withdrew through fire, while the Orcs poured into what remained. Varric's chimera entered the refinery culvert with armor scorched black and 1 track unit grinding itself apart. Behind him, charges detonated in the abandoned Ruses. The explosions blocked the western road beneath wreckage and burning fuel. It would delay the greenskins. Perhaps 5 minutes, perhaps 2. The first prisoner was taken almost by accident. A Nob had been thrown from a wrecked battle wagon and buried beneath 2 dead boys. He was still alive when the recovery squads found him, both legs shattered and 1 tusk broken off at the root. 4 guardsmen dragged him into the culvert because someone in intelligence had issued standing orders for live captures. The Nob laughed through blood while an interrogator demanded clan strength, landing zones and warband designations. It laughed harder when asked how many more Orcs were coming. "You stupid humies," it gurgled. "Dis ain't the Wa." Varric crouched beside it. Ghazghkull Gutsmech has enough machines in the western wastes to bury a hive. Ghazghkull? The Nob spat a clot of black-green blood across Varric's boot. "He's just riding ahead." The laughter stopped. Not because the Nob was afraid of Varric, because somewhere beyond the culvert, a Vox receiver crackled with a transmission no Imperial encryption system had generated. The wounded Orc heard it. Its ruined face changed. The crude amusement vanished. Even pain seemed to leave it. The Nob strained upward despite its broken legs, listening to the burst of guttural speech beneath waves of static. Other Orc prisoners farther down the tunnel began roaring against their restraints. One repeatedly smashed its forehead into a bulkhead until the skin split. The Nob looked at Varric with something far worse than hatred. Reverence. "The Prophet," it whispered. Yarek was already moving toward the command hololith. Reports arrived from every war zone almost simultaneously. Hive Volcanus recorded fresh Orc concentrations moving without the usual clan infighting. In the equatorial jungle, commando attacks intensified along 3 supply routes at once. Fire waste stations reported bad moons traveling beneath Goth glyphs without firing on one another. Evil Suns convoys altered course on common orders. Weird Boy manifestations increased so violently that several greenskin mobs were destroyed by their own psychers, only for the survivors to charge harder afterward. Above Armageddon, Navy augurs counted additional contacts until the numbers exceeded confidence limits. Fleet officers stopped speaking in ship totals and began using tonnage estimates because individual hull identification was becoming meaningless. The tactical. Hololith changed color while Yarrick watched. Imperial green contracted around the hives, fortress belts and orbital facilities. Amber spread across contested roads and industrial sectors. Orc red multiplied through the western wastes, the jungle approaches, manufacturum corridors and coastal regions. Numbers scrolled beside the projections, hundreds of millions under arms on the surface, perhaps more in transit, additional millions serving fleets, docks, artillery trains and labor formations, estimates of greenskin strength varying so wildly that none deserved to be called accurate. Across the greater war zone, when crew populations, defenders, slaves, servitors, Gretchen and arriving Orc hosts were considered, the living mass feeding the conflict was climbing toward billions. A Medici orderly approached Yarrick from behind. "Commissar, your augmetic interface is bleeding again." Yarrick did not look down. Blood had indeed begun soaking through the cloth at his side, where flesh met reconstruction. "Later." "Sir, the tissue around the—" "Later." The orderly withdrew. Varric stood beside the hololith and watched another Imperial position turn amber. "You believe the prisoner?" "I believe the Orcs." Varric looked at him. "Meaning?" Yarrick's natural eye remained fixed on the projection. "They are cooperating. That happens during a war. Not like this." Another transmission crossed the chamber. An astropathic station had gone silent after every sanctioned psyker inside began screaming the same unintelligible phrase. A second reported pressure within the warp, described by its senior astropath as something green pushing against the soul. Navy officers demanded confirmation. None came. Far to the west, Ghazghkull was still laughing. Big Reva thundered across the corpse-strewn highway, while thousands of bikes raced behind him, their engines shaking the dead where they lay. An Orc voice burst across his crude receiver. Ghazghkull's grin remained for the first syllable, then disappeared. He listened. For perhaps the first time that day, Big Reva slowed. The war boss stared upward through Armageddon's poisoned clouds. Across the planet, Auspex stations began failing at once. Orbit twisted. Auger ghosts multiplied across screens, vanished, then returned where empty space should have remained empty. Astropaths collapsed beside their choirs. Several clawed their own eyes bloody before attendants could restrain them. Void ships reported impossible gravitational readings. Green lightning spread behind the clouds, not descending from them, but crawling laterally across the heavens like luminous veins beneath diseased flesh. The light reached from horizon to horizon. Men stopped firing long enough to stare. Orcs did not. They began roaring. The sound rolled across Armageddon in 1,000,000 throats, then 10 million, then numbers no command staff could count. Boys raised choppers toward the sky. Warbikers hammered fists against their engines. Gretchen shrieked. Knobs bellowed until blood vessels burst in their eyes. War bosses who had spent years murdering one another turned toward the same green fire and raised the same glyph. Yarrick walked from the command chamber into the poisoned wind. Varric followed him to the outer parapet. The sky above Armageddon had become a wound of emerald lightning. Something vast was happening beyond it, something the planet's instruments could sense but not comprehend. Yarrick stared upward for a long time. His power claw closed with a hydraulic growl. "Ghazghkull," Varric said. Yarrick's face might have been carved from the ash wastes themselves. "No," he said, "not yet." Another pulse of green light turned night into sickly day. The roar of the Orcs became deafening. Yarrick watched the heavens fold. Ghazghkull has found his road home. Makari had learned long ago that the safest place in the galaxy was directly beneath Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, provided the Prophet knew he was there. Everywhere else was subject to shells, claws, engines, stomping boots, explosions, hungry squigs, bored knobs, and the general enthusiasm of Orcs who had been trapped aboard ship for too many days without anything substantial to kill. Beneath Ghazghkull, there was at least a shadow, and in that shadow, most creatures possessed enough instinct to avoid wandering. Makari stood inside it now, clutching the great boss pole in both hands, while the command deck of the kill cruiser shook hard enough to rattle loose teeth from dead skulls nailed above the bulkheads. The deck had never been designed to contain the machinery surrounding them. That was obvious, even to Makari. Armor plates had been cut away to make room for conduits thicker than battle wagons. Cables ran through doors, walls and gun decks, disappearing into openings where mechs had apparently decided openings ought to exist. Reactors stolen from half a dozen different classes of void ship had been chained, welded and hammered into the same power network. None matched. None should have functioned together. All of them were functioning anyway, which was the important bit. Beyond the armored ports, 9 other kill cruisers held station across an expanse of void crowded with escorts, rocks, hulks, gunships, and lumbering transports. Each carried a piece of the mega teleshocker network. The arrangement was too large to see as a whole, but Makari had seen the scratched glyph map Archimedes had beaten into a steel deck several days earlier. 10 immense vessels formed the teeth of a crooked jaw around empty space, each linked through fields of unstable energy that flickered green across thousands of kilometers. Escort squadrons prowled around the outer perimeter. Smaller vessels raced between formations carrying ammunition, spare parts, buoys, Gretchen, and messages that could not be trusted to Vox. In the central cruiser, the command deck smelled of hot metal, fungus beer, ozone, and cooked flesh. Weird boys had been chained into iron cages along the walls. Some whimpered, some laughed. One had been trying to bite through its own tongue for several hours. Mechs ran between them carrying spanners, cables, hammers, and objects Makari could not identify, shouting contradictory instructions while sparks rained from the ceiling. Somewhere far below, engines the size of hab blocks thundered in uneven rhythm, each detonation passing through the ship like the heartbeat of something too large to be alive. Ghazghkull stood before the forward view slit and watched the void. Even surrounded by machinery intended to break the rules of reality, the Prophet remained the largest thing Makari could properly understand. His mega armor enclosed him in slab after slab of scarred plating, pistons, cables, armor seals, and brutal reinforcement. It did not resemble a suit so much as a bunker that had decided to walk. Every movement brought the grinding complaint of servos forced to obey mass and strength beyond their intended tolerance. Gork's claw rested at his side, the immense powered pincers marked by impact scars and dried blood that no Gretchen had been brave enough to clean. Makari had once seen the claw close around a space marine. There had been a loud crack, followed by several quieter ones, and then the armor had leaked. Mork's roar hung from Ghazghkull's other arm, ammunition feeds disappearing into his warplate like hoses feeding an industrial furnace. Around him stood war bosses who ruled fleets, moons, continents and warbands numbering in the millions. They were enormous creatures by any sensible measure. Beside Ghazghkull, they looked temporary. A Goth boss named Urgrak Ironlug had apparently forgotten that. The mech's Seda alignment's still moving, Urgrak growled. He stood 3 paces behind Ghazghkull, close enough that Makari wondered whether this was bravery or poor judgment. Could wait. More ships coming. More boys. Do it when everything's ready. The command deck quieted by degrees. Hammers stopped. Knobs stopped arguing. Even several weird boys ceased screaming, although one continued making a high whining noise through clenched teeth. Ghazghkull did not turn immediately. That was worse than if he had. Makari saw Urgrak's jaw tighten. The boss was too proud to step backward now that everyone was watching. Ghazghkull finally moved. Servos growled. Armor plates shifted over one another. His head turned first, then the rest of him followed with the deliberate weight of an execution engine changing target. "Ready?" Ghazghkull asked. Urgrak puffed his chest. "Yeah, proper ready. More Daka, more ships, More. You scared? The boss blinked. A few knobs grinned. Urgrak's face darkened. I ain't scared of nothing. Ghazghkull took one step forward. Den why you wanna wait? Urgrak opened his mouth. Gork's claw struck before the answer. Existed. The blow was not a duel. Ghazghkull did not roar, posture, or offer the lesser boss any chance to prove himself. The side of the claw hit Urgrak across the torso with enough force to fold armor inward around ribs and organs. Metal plates collapsed into his chest. His spine broke. Something wet burst from his mouth with the first gout of blood. He crossed the deck sideways, smashed into a bulkhead, and remained embedded there for a heartbeat before gravity dragged him down. His body landed badly. One arm twitched. Ghazghkull crossed the distance and stamped once. Urgrak's breastplate flattened. Blood and ruptured tissue squeezed from broken seams in the armor and spread beneath the prophet's boot. Ghazghkull looked around at the assembled hierarchy. Anyone else scared of Armageddon? Nobody spoke. Good. Makari adjusted his grip on the pole and decided this was one of those occasions when being small was very useful. Ghazghkull returned to the viewing port, while mechs dragged Urgrak's remains away by one ankle. He had not killed the boss, because Urgrak disagreed. Ghazghkull tolerated disagreement when it was useful. Makari had watched him listen to mechs, navigators, weird boys, and even Gretchen when they knew something he wanted to know. Urgrak had died because waiting meant handing the Humies time, and Ghazghkull understood time better than most orcs understood ammunition. The Imperial Navy expected fleets to approach along routes it could identify, intercept, and turn into killing grounds. So Ghazghkull had not brought one fleet. He had brought pieces of one. The 10 kill cruisers had crossed the void under separate screens of escorts, converging only after the Humies committed patrols elsewhere. Hulks waited outside the main approach corridors. Rocks traveled under false debris signatures. Smaller warbands moved independently and were permitted to raid whatever they encountered, provided they reached assigned positions before the signal. The Humies would see disorder, because disorder was what they expected from orcs. By the time they understood the pattern would already be around them. Archimedes had made the impossible part possible. The mech's designs allowed the 10 cruisers to compensate for one another, while the mega teleshocker was active. If one node drifted, the others dragged the field back into alignment. If a reactor failed, neighboring vessels increased output. If a kill cruiser exploded, which several mechs had admitted was not impossible, the system might remain functional long enough to finish the translation. Ghazghkull had taken a weapon whose ordinary use involved throwing matter through places matter had no business traveling, and turned it into an invasion route. Makari understood none of the mathematics. He understood the important part. The Humies had walls. Ghazghkull had found a way to make the walls face the wrong direction. "Power!" bellowed a mech. "More power!" screamed another. "We ain't got more!" "Den nick some!" The ship lurched. Every weird boy on the command deck began screaming simultaneously. Makari ducked. Green light poured from the cages. One weird boy rose against his chains until his feet left the deck. His back arched. His eyes became bright green pits. Flames spilled from his mouth without consuming his tongue. Another slammed both fists against his skull, begging somebody to make the voices stop. Nobody did. The psychic pressure increased until Makari's teeth hurt. He could feel the wah, not as an idea, but as weight. Millions of orcs aboard thousands of vessels were shouting, fighting, firing weapons into empty corridors, beating armor, revving engines, and calling for Ghazghkull. Their belief pressed through the fleet. It crawled along metal. It made lights flicker. It made the caged weird boys howl. One of them exploded. The skull went first. Bone fragments struck the ceiling. Green flame burst from the open neck, while the body remained standing inside its restraints. A heartbeat later, the torso ruptured. Blood, burning organs and fragments of spine sprayed across 3 mechs. One wiped a piece of brain from his goggles and shouted for another weird boy. Ghazghkull did not turn. "More," he said. The cages were opened. Gretchen handlers dragged forward another psyker, kicking and shrieking. He saw the remains of the first and bit through a handler's ear before a knob punched him hard enough to loosen several teeth. The weird boy was chained into position. Energy surged again. Across the formation, the other 9 cruisers responded. Green lightning linked ship to ship. The void between them buckled. At St. Johan's Dock, Imperial Auger crews recorded the first impossible returns as instrument failure. Servitors were disconnected and replaced. Cogitator banks were purged. Machine spirits were placated with incense and emergency rites. The contacts remained. An Auspex officer demanded secondary confirmation and received 3 different answers from 3 independent stations, each equally impossible. Hostile tonnage was appearing inside sectors that had shown empty void moments before. No warp translation flare preceded the arrivals. No conventional drive plume crossed the outer defense perimeter. Matter simply arrived where matter had not been. The first rock materialized badly. Half its mass appeared inside the trailing section of an Orc transport. Both vessels came apart. The explosion opened like a second sun against Armageddon's orbital dark. Millions of tons of wreckage spun outward. Burning compartments separated from the transport, with atmosphere venting in glittering clouds. Orcs, Gretchen, ammunition crates, and pieces of machinery tumbled into vacuum. A surviving escort nearby transmitted laughter over open frequencies. Then 3 more rocks appeared. Then a kill cruiser. Then dozens of attack ships. Battlefleet Armageddon opened fire. Lances crossed the void in white spears brilliant enough to bleach auger lenses. One cut through an Orc escort from bow to stern, armor boiling away before the vessel broke into 2 incandescent halves. Torpedoes fired from Imperial ships and accelerated across thousands of kilometers, their guidance systems selecting targets amid a storm of debris and fresh contacts. Orc gun decks answered with everything that could be loaded, charged, or persuaded to fire. Shells larger than chimeras crossed darkness. Energy beams stabbed wildly between formations. Crude torpedoes detonated too early, too late, or against friendly ships. None of it slowed the invasion. Boarding craft poured forward. Some were purpose-built assault vessels. Others looked like engines with armor welded around them. They swarmed Imperial escorts, losing hundreds to point defense batteries, while the survivors slammed into hull plating. Cutting charges detonated. Magnetic claws bit into armor. Orcs entered the Void War the way they entered every other form of war, by reducing distance until they could hit something with their hands. An Imperial cruiser died near the outer dock approaches after concentrated Orc fire collapsed its void shields. Shells punched through armor. A magazine detonation tore open the lower hull, and tens of thousands vanished in the expanding plume. The ship rolled slowly, still firing from surviving batteries, while its compartments burned. Its final lance shot split an Orc transport whose holds contained more bodies than the cruiser had lost. Behind both wrecks, fresh contacts appeared. That was the moment the Imperial officers understood. Destroying the first wave revealed the second. Destroying the second revealed the third. The enemy was not crossing the battle space. It was being inserted into it. Makari saw none of that directly. He saw it as glyphs on crude displays, and heard it through Orc reports that were mostly shouting. "Hume ship burning," one operator yelled. "Which one?" demanded a knob. "Big one. They're all big. Dat one, den." Another channel filled with roaring as a boarding party entered an Imperial vessel. A third carried nothing but the repeated phrase, "Ghazghkull, Ghazghkull, Ghazghkull," until even the Orc handling the receiver began chanting with it. Ghazghkull listened to the noise for a while. Then he said, "Get the lander ready." Several war bosses looked at one another. One finally found the courage to speak. "Boss, fight's up here." "Yeah. Could run it from the cruiser." Ghazghkull turned his head. The boss immediately discovered something fascinating on the opposite wall. Ghazghkull looked back toward Armageddon, now visible as a cloud-wrapped sphere beyond the fleet. If the biggest boss can't break the biggest fight, he ain't the biggest boss. That ended the discussion. The order spread. Ghazghkull's personal landing force began assembling in cavernous launch decks, while the void battle continued around them. Meganobs locked armor plates into place. Goths loaded shooters and choppers, argued over ammunition, and punched one another away from the best transport positions. Mechs fueled engines until fumes filled entire compartments. Squigs escaped cages and were chased through ranks of laughing boys. Rival clans that had spent the voyage fighting over deck space, food, loot, and imagined insults now moved toward their assigned craft, with a unity that would have been impossible under another warlord. Makari watched clan glyphs illuminate across the fleet. Goths, evil suns, bad moons, blood axes, freebooter crews, warbands whose names he had already forgotten, all of them beneath one greater mark, the glyph of the Prophet. Imperial Vox operators heard the chanting before they identified its source. It bled through unsecured channels, then secured channels, then frequencies that should have carried only machine traffic. Thousands of voices became millions. The distortion flattened individual words until there was only rhythm. Ghazghkull, Ghazghkull, Ghazghkull. Makari climbed into the command compartment of the lander behind his boss and wedged himself beside a reinforcement strut before the ramp sealed. Ghazghkull occupied most of the forward space, his armor locked into restraints designed by mechs, who understood that conventional crash harnesses were for creatures expected to survive conventional crashes. Mork's roar sat ready. Gork's claw flexed once with a hydraulic scream. The lander launched. Acceleration crushed Makari against the bulkhead. Around them, hundreds of Orc craft plunged toward Armageddon. Imperial interceptors came first. Gunfire flashed across the descent corridor. One Orc lander vanished in a sphere of flame. Another collided with its killer, and both machines spun toward the planet locked together, pieces burning away in the upper atmosphere. Anti-air batteries opened from the surface. Tracers climbed through the poisoned clouds in dense streams. Missiles crossed between descending craft. Engines screamed. Warning klaxons shouted uselessly inside the compartment. The lander shook hard enough to throw a knob from his restraints. Ghazghkull laughed. Armageddon rose beneath them. Cloud layers parted in flashes of fire, revealing ash wastes, hive lights, burning industrial belts, and the scars of wars so old that cities had grown around them. Makari knew the stories. Every Orc knew the stories. Armageddon had beaten Ghazghkull before. Twice the Humies had endured him. Twice the world had refused to die. The Prophet leaned toward the armored view slit. Green fire reflected in his eyes. His laughter grew louder as another Imperial fighter came apart outside. Armageddon had survived what Ghazghkull had been. Now the beast had come to discover whether it could survive what he had become. The first thing Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka did upon returning to Armageddon was choose the place where the humans were strongest. His lander came down through curtains of flak and burning aircraft, its engines vomiting black smoke as it crossed the outer refinery belt west of Hive Death Mire, and the pilot tried twice to alter course toward the safer Orc-held approaches before Ghazghkull reached forward and crushed the control yoke beneath one armored hand. "Dare," he said, pointing through the shaking view slit toward a line of Imperial armor dug into the ash beyond the refineries. The pilot stared at the tanks, then at the Prophet, and decided that questioning the order would be a shorter form of death than obeying it. The lander changed angle. Anti-air fire hammered its belly. One engine detonated, another began screaming. Makari clung to a reinforcement bar, while mega-armored knobs roared approval and loose ammunition bounced across the deck. The craft hit Armageddon hard enough to tear off half its undercarriage, plowed through a fuel pipeline, and turned sideways as its remaining engines buried themselves in the ash. The rear ramp blew outward before the machine had stopped moving. Boys spilled into sunlight already firing. Gretchen tumbled after them, carrying ammunition crates twice their weight. Meganobs stepped through flame, their armor plates glowing around the edges. Ghazghkull came last, not because he was cautious, but because the door had been too small until one of his knobs tore half the frame away. The soil of Armageddon cracked beneath his first step. Shells began landing almost immediately. A basilisk round struck the wrecked lander and turned the rear compartment into a furnace, throwing bodies and armor plates across the landing zone. Another hit among the Gretchen ammunition carriers. The detonation reduced half a dozen of them to wet scraps and hurled burning shells across the ash. Boys laughed, shouted, and ran toward the nearest Imperial positions because the fire was coming from that direction and nothing more complicated needed to be understood. Ghazghkull stood in the middle of the bombardment and breathed the poisoned air through the filtration systems built into his mega armor. Armageddon smelled the way he remembered it. Promethium, hot steel, ash, blood, chemical waste, and war. The planet had changed. Its cities had grown. Its fortifications had multiplied. Its defenders had replaced old ruins with new guns. None of that mattered. The important thing was that it still fought. The Steel Legion Tank Company had less than a minute to understand what had landed behind them. Captain Holst Varren saw the first orcs through the cupola optics of his command Leman Russ and assumed they were a raiding force until the magnification found the shape walking through the burning wreckage. The target identification cogitator could not classify it properly. It offered Warboss, rejected the scale, recalculated, then returned a threat glyph large enough to cover the tactical display. Varren did not wait for confirmation. All vehicles, target the largest contact. Battle cannons first. Less cannons follow. Do not advance. Repeat. Do not close. 14. Leman Russ battle tanks turned their turrets almost together. Autocannon carriers on the outer line traversed. Chimeras shifted position to clear fields of fire. Heavy bolter teams dismounted behind reinforced berms. The first battle cannon fired, then the second, and within seconds, the landing zone disappeared beneath explosions. Boys came apart in chunks. One shell detonated beneath a mob and lifted bodies high enough that pieces were still falling when the next blast arrived. Meganob armor buckled under direct hits. A Nob lost both legs at the hip and continued firing from the ground until a Lascannon beam bored through his torso. Heavy bolters cut lanes through advancing orcs, mass reactive rounds punching into green flesh before exploding and opening backs, rib cages and skulls from within. Ghazghkull vanished beneath dust, fire and fragments of his own army. Varren kept firing. Again, same target, again. A Lascannon struck inside the smoke and turned part of it white. Another battle cannon round landed exactly where the Prophet had been standing. The company cheered over Vox channels until something moved inside the burning cloud. Ghazghkull emerged walking. His armor was blackened. One shoulder plate had been split. A cable beneath his left arm sprayed sparks with every step. Blood ran from beneath the iron plates around his neck and mixed with ash across his chest. He had been wounded. That was the terrible part. The fire had not passed harmlessly around him, nor had some impossible field made Imperial weapons meaningless. The tank company had hurt him. They had cracked armor, torn flesh, and burned skin. They had applied enough firepower to destroy a fortified company position, and he was still coming, because pain had only told him where the enemy was. Mork's roar lifted. The weapon opened fire with a sound like a factory collapsing. Streams of ammunition crossed the Imperial line so densely that individual shots ceased to matter. A heavy bolter emplacement disappeared first. Sandbags burst. The gunner's upper body disintegrated across the parapet. The loader tried to crawl and was hit through the spine, his torso thrown ahead of his legs before both vanished beneath the next impacts. Ghazghkull walked behind the fire, sweeping the weapon across dugouts, infantry revetments, and vehicle crews. Ferrocrete chipped, then fractured, then came apart under sustained punishment. Men vanished from firing steps in sprays of blood and armor fragments. One autocannon team managed 3 shots before Mork's roar found them. The first gunner lost both hands and part of his face. The second was struck through the abdomen and folded backward around the detonation. The ammunition box between them exploded a heartbeat later and filled the trench with torn flesh and brass. The Steel Legion fired back. Because retreating without orders was still desertion, even when the thing coming toward them appeared capable of killing a tank with its hands. Lasguns flashed from dugouts. Crack missiles streaked across the ash. A missile struck Ghazghkull's shoulder and snapped his head sideways. He kept walking. A second hit a meganob behind him and blew the orc into 3 armored pieces. Ghazghkull stepped over the remains without looking. Makari ran somewhere behind his right leg, with the great boss pole angled forward, disappearing each time incoming fire threw up ash around him. The banner was already holed in 2 places. Makari considered this disrespectful and shouted insults at the humans while remaining carefully inside the Prophet's shadow. Varen's command tank lost its battle cannon when an orc rocket struck the mantlet and jammed the mechanism half open. The driver tried to reverse. The track on the left side broke, whipping loose and coiling behind them. Ghazghkull saw the crippled Russ. Varen saw Ghazghkull see it. "Forward," the captain ordered. His gunner looked at him. "Sir?" "Forward. Ram him." The driver understood immediately. The surviving track bit into the ash, and the tank lurched ahead, engine screaming as it dragged the ruined side behind it. Ghazghkull stopped firing. Mork's roar lowered. The Russ came toward him with 30 tons of armor and momentum, hull-mounted heavy bolter firing until the barrel glowed. Ghazghkull stepped into it. Gork's claw closed around the tank's front quarter. The power field shrieked against armor. Sparks burst from the glacis. Ghazghkull's boots dug trenches into the ash as the Russ continued pushing, engine howling under full output. For an instant, the machine moved him. Then the claw tightened. Armor buckled inward. The tank's forward plate folded around the pincers with a grinding scream. The driver died when the compartment collapsed. Ghazghkull twisted. Metal tore. He wrenched the entire upper corner of the hull away and hurled it aside. Flames rolled from the opening. The gunner was screaming. The loader tried to climb through the turret hatch. Ghazghkull caught the turret ring with the claw and ripped upward. The turret tore loose with men still inside it, throwing burning fuel and severed cabling across the ground. He shoved the crippled hull sideways just as another Russ fired. The incoming battle cannon shell struck Varen's wreck instead. The explosion punched through the open interior, detonated ammunition, and turned the vehicle into a burning wall between Ghazghkull and the remaining tanks. The orcs roared and surged after him. The thing that stopped them was taller than the refinery towers. The Imperial Knight had already been wounded elsewhere. Its heraldic plate was burned black on one side, one shoulder pauldron had been torn away, and hydraulic fluid leaked from its left knee joint in glistening streams. It strode from between shattered processing stacks, with one weapon arm reduced to a mangled frame, and the other still carrying a rapid-fire battle cannon. The pilot had no support household around him. No banners flew from the carapace. The machine looked like a knight, only in the way a corpse still looked human after enough had been cut away. Its battle cannon fired. The shell struck the orc advance and erased 30 boys. The second landed among Ghazghkull's meganobs. Armor, organs and weapons spun across the battlefield. One knob hit the ground without a head and remained upright on his knees for several seconds before falling forward. The knight's secondary heavy stubbers opened, cutting down Gretchen and boys around Ghazghkull. The orc advance faltered. Ghazghkull looked up. The knight fired again. He charged. The battle cannon shell struck in front of him, and the explosion engulfed his entire body. Makari flattened himself behind a wrecked chimera and waited for the smoke to clear. Ghazghkull came through it, with one side of his armor burning. The knight attempted to step backward and bring its remaining gun down far enough to fire at him directly. Ghazghkull did not run toward the center of the machine. He angled toward the damaged left leg. Mork's roar hammered the knee housing while he closed, ammunition sparking from armor, punching through exposed hydraulic lines and actuator casings. The knight stamped. Ghazghkull moved inside the arc, seized a structural brace behind the knee with Gork's claw, and pulled. The first attempt failed. The knight kicked him. Ghazghkull left the ground and struck the side of a refinery support hard enough to bend the steel column. Half the surrounding orcs went silent. The prophet dropped to one knee. Blood ran from his mouth. Then he stood. The knight turned. Ghazghkull laughed and charged again. This time he attacked the hip. Mork's roar emptied into the articulation point while the pilot tried to pivot. Armor fractured. Hydraulic fluid burst outward in a pressurized spray. Ghazghkull reached the leg, locked Gork's claw around the exposed actuator housing, and tore it free. The knight staggered. The damaged knee failed under its own weight. Thousands of tons of war machine came down sideways, crushing orcs beneath it and throwing ash across the refinery district. Ghazghkull climbed onto the fallen torso before the pilot could stabilize the remaining systems. Stubbers fired around him uselessly. He crossed the carapace, found the cockpit housing, and drove Gork's claw through it. Armor screamed. The claw closed. The pilot had time for one transmission, a burst of static and half a prayer to the Emperor, before the cockpit collapsed inward. Blood ran from the seams. Ghazghkull tore the front of the command compartment away and threw it aside. The boys went mad. They surged over the knight's corpse, firing weapons into the air and screaming Ghazghkull's name. The prophet descended from the wreck without acknowledging them. He looked east instead. Armageddon stretched before him beneath toxic cloud. Hive lights burned beyond the refineries. Transport arteries crossed the wastes in straight lines of ferrocrete and armored rail. Manufacturum stacks covered the horizon. Fuel pipelines ran between cities. Tank columns moved along roads wide enough for whole regiments. Ghazghkull remembered them. He remembered where the Steel Legion came from, where the machines were built, where the Humies moved their shells, their tanks, and their food. Armageddon did not live because its walls were thick. It lived because everything behind the walls kept feeding them. He pointed with Gork's claw. "Dat road." A knob looked east. "To the Hive?" "No." The knob frowned. Ghazghkull pointed farther south, toward the transport network feeding Deathmire from the Manufacturum belts. "Break dat. Den dat one. Leave the Hive." Makari understood before the knob did. If the orcs attacked the walls, the humans would send ammunition. If the orcs attacked the roads, the walls would starve. Engines announced Ghazghkull before anyone saw him. Big Rever came across the ash in a storm of smoke, with warbikers streaming behind it. Ghazghkull rode straight through the shattered Imperial line, jumped the wreck of a Chimera, and slid the bike sideways to a stop near Ghazghkull. He was laughing when he dismounted. "Boss, you see that? Humie's got tanks everywhere. Good ones too. Nearly fast." Ghazghkull looked at him. Ghazghkull's grin shrank slightly. "Deathmire still standing?" Ghazghkull scratched at one tusk. "For now." "Why?" "Lots of guns." Ghazghkull stared at him. Ghazghkull added, "And walls." Ghazghkull stepped closer. Ghazghkull was enormous among orcs, powerful enough that lesser war bosses gave him room without being asked. Beside the prophet, he looked merely large. Ghazghkull did not strike him. Instead, he pointed toward the eastern routes. "More guns coming down there. More tanks, more Humies." Ghazghkull's grin returned. "Stop 'em?" Ghazghkull shook his head. "Make 'em come faster." The warbiker blinked. Ghazghkull looked toward the distant Hive. "Want the angels? Want the big walkers? Want all of them? Every fort? Every tank? Every Humie that thinks he can fight?" Ghazghkull's eyes widened with understanding. "More fighting. More wah!" The speed freaks around them roared. Ghazghkull turned away before the sound had finished. He wanted the humans to reinforce Deathmire. He wanted them to believe every road mattered. He wanted fortress after fortress screaming for aid until Armageddon became a signal fire visible to warriors across the galaxy. He wanted titans walking. He wanted space marines descending from the heavens. He wanted every enemy strong enough to survive the first blow. And somewhere among them, he wanted one old human. Hours later, a surviving Steel Legion. Pict recorder reached Imperial Command. The footage was corrupted by static and heat distortion. Officers watched Ghazghkull emerge from bombardment, tear apart a Lehman Russ, and cripple an Imperial Knight. Several insisted the images had been altered by Orc propaganda or damaged machine spirits. One Magos requested the recording be quarantined pending verification. Yarrick watched it once, then again. He said nothing while the night fell. The Ghazghkull he remembered had been monstrous. The creature on the Pict feed was larger, stronger, more heavily armored, and worst of all, more deliberate. Authentic, Yarrick said. No one contradicted him. Back in the refinery ruins, an Orc signal operator came running toward Ghazghkull, hard enough to trip over a corpse. He scrambled upright and shouted before anyone could hit him. "Boss, word from Dahumes." Ghazghkull turned. Old Baal Eye. Everything around him seemed to quiet. "What?" "He's alive." Ghazghkull stopped moving. For several heartbeats, the greatest Orc on Armageddon stood utterly still. Then he began to laugh. The sound rolled across the ruins. Boys nearby started laughing, because Ghazghkull was laughing. Nobs joined them. Warbikers roared engines. Gretchen screamed and danced around burning wrecks without knowing why. The laughter spread until the whole captured battlefield shook with it. Ghazghkull raised Gork's claw. "No one kills Baal Eye." The laughter faded. His voice became a growl. "No one." He looked east toward Hive Deathmire. "Old Baal Eye's mine." Armageddon turned red by degrees beneath Marneus Calgar's hands. The hololithic sphere revolved above the strategium dais of the battle barge Fist of Macraga, its continents rendered in layers of tactical light, imperial bastions glowing blue-white, contested regions burning amber and greenskin concentrations spreading across the planet like an infection made visible. Every few seconds, another rune changed color. A refinery complex west of Deathmire vanished from the Imperial network. The convoy route through the northern ash wastes became contested. 3 orbital auger stations reported Orc vessels translating into local space by mechanisms that the fleet's navigators insisted were not warp translation at all. Around Calgar, officers of the Ultramarines stood in disciplined silence while servitors fed fresh casualty returns into the cogitator banks and adepts of the Navis Imperialis whispered over tactical slates. Beyond the armored ports, the void itself was crowded with war. Lance fire crossed darkness in white scars. Orc wrecks burned without flame, spilling atmosphere and bodies into the black. Reinforcement vessels continued arriving under escort, translating far enough from the planet to avoid the worst of the Greenskin fleet, and then fighting their way inward beneath volleys of torpedoes and massed gunfire. Strike cruisers bearing the heraldry of chapters from across the Imperium moved among Navy squadrons and Mechanicus transports. Battle barges turned with glacial menace. Troop ships carried regiments that had never seen Armageddon and would die beneath its poisoned sky before they learned the names of its hives. The temptation, Calgar knew, was to hurl all of it at Ghazghkull until weight of arms achieved what reason could not. That was precisely what the Orc wanted. Again, Calgar said. The hololith reset to the beginning of the last major engagement. Brother Sergeant Castor Venn watched from the lower ring of the strategium as the tactical reconstruction unfolded. Orc warbands converged upon an Imperial armored line from 3 directions. Imperial reserves responded. More Orcs appeared. The defenders reinforced again. A crude greenskin glyph marked the arrival of Ghazghkull himself, and the entire battle seemed to contract around his presence. Warbands that had been advancing independently altered direction, Speed freaks abandoned easier prey. Artillery shifted. Even mobs separated by kilometers appeared to respond to the same instinct. The resulting engagement had become a slaughterhouse in which the Imperium inflicted extraordinary casualties and still lost ground. Ven had fought greenskins on half a dozen worlds and had never considered them simple. Any warrior who mistook brutality for stupidity tended to live only long enough to make the error once. This was different. The Wa was behaving less like an army than a predatory ecology. Violence drew violence. Every Imperial counterattack gave the Orcs a point around which to gather, and every gathering made them stronger. Ghazghkull does not require clean lines of command, Calgar said. His voice carried through the strategium without need of amplification. He requires momentum. The Orcs converge upon resistance because resistance is the mechanism by which their war effort sustains itself. We will not give him a single battle large enough to feed that momentum. A Black Templar's marshal stood opposite the Ultramarines delegation, black armor marked by white crosses and devotional script. Then we deny him battle by giving him 10, he said. There was approval rather than objection in the words, though the expression beneath his shaven scalp remained hard. My brethren can strike the largest concentration west of Deathmire. If the Xenos desire a center around which to gather, we shall give them one and drown it in their own blood. You will strike where ordered, Calgar replied, and withdraw when ordered. The marshal's jaw tightened. Withdrawal is not a word spoken lightly upon crusade. No, said Calgar, which is why I have used it deliberately. A low chuckle came from the Space Wolves representative, a scarred wolf guard whose grey armor carried pelts burned black at the edges from some previous campaign. He means he does not want you taking the first hill you see and swearing to die on it. The Templar turned toward him. And the sons of Russ will obey every line upon an ultramarine slate. We will obey the hunt, the Space Wolf said. Whether your slate keeps pace is another question. Before the exchange could harden, a Salamander's captain spoke from beside the tactical projection. There are still several million civilians moving through the Hell's Reach feeder corridors. If those routes are abandoned for the sake of a cleaner offensive, they will be overrun. An Ultramarines lieutenant answered, those corridors are not part of the principal attack axis. They are Imperial lives. They are also outside the primary objective. The Salamander's gaze hardened. Then your primary objective is incomplete. Ven watched Calgar rather than the arguing officers. His chapter master allowed the disagreement to breathe because disagreement exposed priorities, and priorities mattered more than professions of obedience. The Black Templars wanted the enemy's strongest point because their faith demanded proof beneath the Emperor's gaze. The Space Wolves accepted coordinated war, but would interpret opportunity through the instincts of the hunt. The Salamanders would spend warriors and war machines to preserve civilian lives that another commander might classify as strategically expendable. None of them were wrong within the laws of their own brotherhood. Calgar's task was not to make them think alike. It was to make their differences strike the same enemy at the same hour. The hololith changed. A web of attack vectors appeared around the major Orc concentrations. Operation Imperator begins at the next viable orbital window, Calgar said. We will not seek a single decisive engagement. We sever arteries. We destroy ammunition stocks, fuel reserves, and staging grounds. We break the roads that allow separate mobs to become a Wah. We force Ghazghkull to choose between objectives. Every time he concentrates, we strike somewhere he is weakened. Every time he disperses, we destroy the isolated elements. We will not measure success by the number of Orcs killed. There will always be more Orcs. We measure success by whether their war continues to move. The Strategium Vox clicked, and the image of Commissar Sebastian Yarrick resolved above an auxiliary projector. The transmission from the surface was imperfect, static cutting through his outline. Yet Ven recognized him immediately. Age had done nothing to diminish the severity of the face. Augmetics had replaced what war had taken. The great power claw remained visible at the edge of the transmission, like a relic wrested from the enemy and made obedient through hatred. "You are assuming Thraka is reacting to your movements," Yarrick said. Calgar faced the image. "You believe otherwise." "I believe he is inviting them." Several officers shifted their attention toward the Commissar. Yarrick continued. "Armageddon is not merely a target to him. It is proof. Every regiment that arrives tells the Orcs the war matters. Every chapter insignia seen beneath our sky becomes another reason for greenskins elsewhere to come here. He attacks a world the Imperium cannot abandon because he understands what abandoning it would mean. We reinforce because we must. He grows stronger because we reinforce." The Templar Marshal folded his arms. "Then we kill the beast and end the legend." Yarrick's expression did not move. "Men have been saying that about Ghazghkull for longer than some chapters have maintained their current companies." The words might have been an insult from another man. From Yarrick, they sounded like weather. Calgar studied the planetary sphere. "Then we give him no legend worth having." Preparation for Operation Imperator consumed the fleet. Drop pods were loaded into assault racks by the hundred until whole decks became forests of ceramite capsules waiting for release. Thunderhawks stood wing to wing beneath maintenance gantries, while tech marines moved among them, accompanied by servitors carrying sensors, sacred unguents, and diagnostic tools. Armorers inspected bolt rifles, heavy bolters, melter weapons, plasma incinerators, and chainswords beneath the gaze of hooded serfs. Machine spirits were awakened, tested, and placated. Damaged plate was replaced. Helm lenses were recalibrated. Campaign badges for Armageddon appeared on warplate, some painted in fresh color, others carved directly into ceramite as vows that could not be washed away. Black Templars knelt before chaplains and renewed oaths to the God Emperor. Space wolves gathered in loud circles around armor benches, boasting of the deeds they intended to carve into saga, while checking ammunition with the precision of veteran killers. Salamanders inspected flamer seals and melter charge assemblies beside crews, preparing transports for civilian extraction as well as assault. Ultramarines stood before tactical projections until each squad leader knew not merely his own objective, but the fire corridors, withdrawal routes, orbital timings, and reserve commitments of those fighting beside him. To an untrained eye, the fleet looked chaotic. To Ven, it was the sound of a weapon being assembled. On the surface, Major Ren Varric discovered that reinforcement did not mean restoration. His surviving Steel Legion formation received replacement chimeras, whose paint did not match. Several Lehman Russ battle tanks transferred from a regiment that had lost most of its infantry support, fresh laspacks, crack grenades, autocannon ammunition, and enough promethium to keep the column moving for another offensive. What he did not receive were enough men. Empty places remained inside the transports. Some squads had been combined until officers commanded soldiers whose names they did not know. New vehicles were crewed by survivors pulled from wrecks. Munitorum clerks called the formation combat capable because the required percentage of machines could move and fire. Varric considered that proof that clerks should occasionally be made to ride inside those machines. Nevertheless, when the order came, his column formed beneath the poisoned dawn. Fuel bowsers moved between chimeras. Engine seers whispered Binharic prayers over abused engines. Recovery vehicles waited behind the line with towing gear ready, because a tank dragged from the battlefield could be repaired, while a tank abandoned to orcs would return painted red and carrying twice as many guns. Ammunition carriers sat nose to tail beside basilisk emplacements. Servitors moved shells with tireless mechanical obedience. The army that would be remembered in casualty roles as armor and infantry was supported by a second army of mechanics, loaders, drivers, scribes, medici orderlies, and machine slaves, without whom none of it would advance a kilometer. Operation Imperator began with darkness falling from orbit. Ven's drop pod struck an Orc artillery park. At the same instant, Navy attack craft screamed across the eastern approach routes. Retrojets fired hard enough to turn the ground white beneath the descending capsule. The pod hit, restraints released, and 5 armored doors blew outward into a world already tearing itself apart. Ven crossed the threshold before the first door finished falling. His bolt rifle came up. A mech carrying a spanner almost as large as a guardsman turned toward him, and lost its head to the first mass reactive shell. Squad, advance by pair. Gun pits first. Mark ammunition stores for strike. His brothers answered with acknowledgements rather than battle cries. Bolters spoke in controlled bursts. Orcs running toward the pod came apart under disciplined fire, their bodies detonating from within, where mass reactive rounds penetrated muscle and bone. An ultramarine beside Ven put 2 shots into a nob's chest, shifted immediately to the next target, and allowed the explosive detonation to finish the first without watching it die. Across hundreds of kilometers, the same violence arrived at once. Black Templars descended upon a gargant construction field under the tolling of assault bells, chains wards igniting as they hit the ground among mobs of builders and guards. Space Wolves landed against a fuel depot and were through its perimeter before the Orcs understood the direction of attack. Salamanders immolated a warband assembling beside a refugee corridor, sheets of promethium fire consuming boys, while armored transports behind them moved Imperial civilians east beneath cover. Navy marauders and thunderbolts struck Orc columns feeding the Hive routes. Bombs turned convoys into burning chains of wreckage. Varric's Steel Legion armor advanced beneath the air assault, chimeras running behind Lehman Rooses, while basilisk fire landed ahead of them in timed concentrations. For several hours, Operation Imperator worked exactly as Calgar had intended. Orc lines broke. Gargant scaffolds burned with thousands of workers still upon them. Ammunition compounds detonated in rolling firestorms that hurled scrap and body parts over entire industrial districts. A war boss attempting to gather 3 separate mobs found his assembly ground struck by Thunderhawks seconds before his lieutenants arrived. Another concentration was caught between Steel Legion armor and a Salamander's blocking force. The Orcs compressed into a refinery basin where artillery killed them by the thousand. Ven's squad destroyed 6 gun pits, 2 ammunition bunkers, and a teleporter beacon before withdrawing toward the planned extraction point. The enemy seemed unable to decide where to strike because the Imperium had attacked everywhere that mattered. Then the empty command posts began appearing. An Ultramarine strike force landed on a greenskin command nexus and found only burning scrap and dead Gretchen. A Templar assault reached a concentration designated as containing thousands of boys and discovered crude mannequins built from armor plates around engine blocks left running to imitate heat signatures. Space Wolves pursued a retreating mob and found the route mined with captured Imperial munitions. Commandos hit a fuel column behind Varric's advance, killing drivers and setting 3 Bowsers alight before disappearing into drainage culverts. Teleporter signatures flared behind positions that Fleet Command had classified as secure, disgorging meganobs directly into ammunition parks. Within a single hour, the tactical pattern changed. Calgar saw it first. The hololith aboard the Fist of Macragge showed Imperial assault vectors reaching their objectives, yet the Orcs were no longer where the objectives said they should be. "They are abandoning fixed centers before we strike," an operations officer reported. "Not abandoning," Calgar said. "Trading." "For what, my lord?" "Time." He expanded the projection. Several Imperial spearheads had moved deeper because they believed enemy command positions were collapsing. Behind them, logistics routes stretched thin. Orc formations that had appeared broken were converging upon those routes instead of defending territory. Ghazghkull had surrendered artillery pits, workshops, and crude headquarters because the Imperium expected him to value them. In exchange, he had drawn elite forces away from the transport arteries that kept their offensive alive. "Recall second wave assaults," Calgar ordered. "Reserve Thunderhawks to extraction pattern. Tell every commander that pursuit beyond assigned limits is forbidden." The Black Templars protested. The Space Wolves asked whether a retreating war boss counted as an assigned limit. Calgar answered both with the same word: no. Ven received the revised order while moving through the remains of an Imperial bastion marked as secure on every tactical slate. The first sign something was wrong was the silence. The second was the tanks. 3 Lehman Russes lay beside the approach road, not destroyed by gunfire, but opened. One had its turret torn away. Another had been peeled apart along the engine deck, armor bent outward as though something enormous had forced its hands into the machine and pulled. Bodies remained inside. Some had been burned. Others had been crushed so completely that Ven's helm display identified them as biological residue rather than casualties. "Sergeant," Brother Pelion said. Ven followed his gaze. The dreadnought lay 50 meters ahead. It had once been an ancient Castroferrum pattern war machine, belonging to a chapter Ven did not recognize beneath the soot. Both arms were gone. One had been ripped from the shoulder mounting and driven into the ground several meters away. The sarcophagus housing had been opened, not penetrated by melter fire. Opened. Hundreds of dead orcs surrounded it, suggesting the dreadnought had killed until its ammunition depleted and then continued killing at close range. The final enemy had reached it anyway. A wounded steel legionnaire sat against a broken wall nearby, rebreather mask hanging loose, one hand pressed to his abdomen. Ven knelt beside him. "What happened here?" The man looked up at the blue-armored giant and began laughing weakly. "One orc." Ven waited. The soldier swallowed. "No, not one orc. A machine. Thought it was a machine." Another survivor crawled from beneath a collapsed firing step. "War boss," he rasped. "Biggest damned war boss I ever saw." The first man shook his head. "Wasn't a war boss." "What was it?" The soldier looked toward the open tanks. Ven already knew the answer. Calgar knew it minutes later. The image of the ruined bastion appeared above the strategium table, beside reports from the failed Orc command centers and the new attacks on Imperial logistics. Calgar erased 3 attack vectors, then 4 more. He redrew Operation Imperator around the reality they had been resisting since the campaign began. Ghazghkull was not a target sitting at the center of an Orc army. He was the intelligence shaping it, and he was learning. A warning rune appeared over the southern ash wastes, then another, then dozens. New Orc columns were moving east in numbers too large for local augurs to resolve cleanly. Battle wagons, war bikes, stompers, infantry mobs and artillery trains were converging upon a scarred stretch of Armageddon, whose tactical designation carried more history than many worlds. Calgar enlarged the region. Old Titan wrecks lay there beneath centuries of ash. Gargant carcasses rusted among them. Roads had been rebuilt across battlefields whose dead had never been counted. The Mannheim Gap was filling with orcs. The Mannheim Gap had been fortified so many times that the ground itself seemed to remember war. Beneath the newest trench lines lay the collapsed revetments of older campaigns, and beneath those rested the rusting bones of machines that had died before many of the men now defending the gap had been born. Titan limbs protruded from the ash, like the ribs of extinct gods. The blackened skull of a Gargant had become part of an Imperial firing position, its vast iron jaw packed with sandbags and ammunition crates. Across more than 20 kilometers of broken ground, the Armageddon Steel Legion had formed a defense in depth around armor rather than men. Chimeras sat hull down behind wrecked super heavies. Lehman Russ companies occupied prepared revetments with only turrets and guns exposed. Rogel Dawn battle tanks anchored the central approaches, their heavy armor placed where the orcs would be forced to come through narrow lanes between ancient wreckage. Farther back, basilisk batteries stood in regimented rows behind blast walls, while manticores waited with missile racks elevated toward the poisoned sky. Beyond them loomed the silhouettes of super-heavy tanks and the towering shapes of Titan engines, warhounds stalking between the lines, while a Reaver stood motionless behind the center, its reactor glow pulsing through the haze. On the western horizon, the orcs gathered in such numbers that the wastes appeared to move. Battle wagons crowded beside trucks and buggies. Stompers pushed through them like ships through surf. Larger gargants stood behind the mass, furnace mouths glowing, gun decks bristling with cannon. Between every machine packed more boys than any Auspex station could count. Major Ren Varric received his order through a voice transmission so brief that he listened to it twice, not because he had failed to understand, but because he wanted to be certain there was nothing hidden beneath the words. Hold forward line until secondary positions are complete. No timetable for reinforcement, no promise of relief, no mention of survival. His cohort occupied the center left of the first defensive belt, which meant his surviving chimeras and attached tanks had been placed directly in the path of one of the largest orc concentrations. Varric closed the message and looked around the troop compartment. Nobody asked what command had said. They knew from the way ammunition was being distributed. Men checked the seals of their rebreathers, ran thumbs over lasgun charge indicators, and pushed spare power packs into chest webbing. A loader inside the chimera kissed 2 fingers and pressed them against the feed housing of the hull heavy bolter, not as a gesture of sentiment, but as a habit inherited from crews who had survived too many breakdowns to doubt the existence of machine spirits. Outside, engine seers moved between vehicles with mechadendrites twitching, blessing engines in binharic bursts, while crews tightened track assemblies and filled coolant reservoirs. Nobody spoke of courage. Nobody invoked glory. Men who expected to live discussed ammunition. Men who expected to die did the same. The first basilisk salvo went overhead shortly before dawn. Hundreds of guns fired in staggered sequence, and for several seconds, the entire eastern half of the gap became a wall of sound. Recoil drove Earthshaker carriages into their braces. Loader crews hauled shells from racks as fast as servitors could bring them forward. The projectiles disappeared into the cloud cover and descended among the orc front in long, screaming arcs. Through magnoculars, Varric saw the western horizon vanish beneath fire. Battle wagons were overturned, trucks became burning frames. Hundreds of boys disappeared inside explosions, and thousands more surged around the craters without slowing. The manticores fired next. Missile trails clawed white lines across the dark sky and fell among the orc artillery concentrations. 3 greenskin gun batteries vanished beneath overlapping detonations. A 4th continued firing, even while half its crews burned. The orc answer came without precision, and therefore without mercy. Their shells wandered across kilometers of ground. Some landed in empty ash. Some overshot the defensive lines entirely and smashed into supply columns. Others hit places no Imperial fire control officer would ever have selected because there was no target there worth the ammunition. Those were the shells Varric feared most. One struck an assembly area behind the center and removed 3 chimeras, a fuel bowser, and nearly an entire infantry platoon in a single flash. Another landed short, gouging a crater large enough to swallow a Lehman Russ to the turret ring. A third hit the roof of an ammunition carrier. The vehicle ceased existing. Men and vehicle plating rained onto positions hundreds of meters away. Within minutes, the poisoned atmosphere had become a mixture of ash, propellant smoke, atomized soil, pulverized metal, and the fine red mist of bodies struck so completely that nothing remained to recover. Visibility collapsed. Auspex became unreliable. Tank crews fought through targeting optics and shouted grid corrections to one another, while the artillery duel continued above them like the anger of distant gods. Then, the orc line began to move. Varric had seen massive assaults before. Mannheim made all of them look small. Battle wagons came first, driving abreast until wreckage forced them into irregular columns. Trucks filled the gaps, engines screaming, boys clinging to armor plates and firing shooters into the sky. Stompus advanced behind them, crude guns hammering at the Imperial line, while Gretchen swarmed around their feet. Lehman Russ crews opened fire by section instead of individually. Battle cannons struck the lead wagons until one burst apart, then every turret shifted to the next. Vanquisher pattern tank hunters and Lascanon teams ignored the lighter vehicles and engaged Stompus at range, firing at joints, gun housings and reactor compartments. Rogel Dawns held their ground near the center, oppressor cannons firing through lanes cleared by withdrawing chimeras. Infantry remained. Mounted until wreckage, trenches and tank traps forced the Orc vehicles to slow. Only then did rear ramps fall and Steel Legion squads dismount beneath the covering fire of multi-lacers and hull-heavy bolters. They fired, moved, remounted, and shifted position before the speed freaks could pin them down. Any chimera that lost mobility was stripped if possible, and abandoned if not. Any tank that could still move remained in the line, regardless of how much armor it had lost. The Orcs filled the anti-tank ditches with their own dead. The first truck struck a mine and flipped onto its roof. The second rammed into it. The third tried to climb both wrecks and was destroyed by a battle cannon, leaving its burning hull wedged across the trench. Then another came, and another. Boys poured from immobilized vehicles and ran forward carrying planks, scrap plates, and pieces of destroyed armor. Gretchen were kicked toward the minefields in packs. The first rank vanished in explosions. The second ran through the gaps. The third began marking safe routes with scraps of cloth stolen from corpses. Varric watched through the magnification of his command cupola as an entire mob crossed a ditch, not by building a bridge, but by climbing across the wrecked vehicles and bodies of those who had gone before. A dead Nob was trampled into the ash. A boy missing one arm dragged himself forward until another stepped on his back and used him as footing. The Orcs did not care. Every destroyed truck made the road flatter. Every corpse raised the bottom of the ditch. Every mine consumed a body that could be replaced by 10 more. The first defensive belt began to bend by midday. "Track damage, left side," someone shouted through Varric's intercom. His chimera lurched as the driver corrected. A glancing rocket strike had torn away part of the track guard, but left the assembly intact. "Keep moving," Varric ordered. Ahead, a Rogel Dawn fired point-blank into a battle wagon that had broken through the ditch line. The shell punched through frontal armor and detonated inside. The wagon split along its side. Burning boys spilled from it and were cut down by laser guns from a dismounted squad sheltering behind a wrecked Baneblade. One Orc reached the Steel Legion position with its torso on fire and hacked a guardsman from shoulder to sternum before a melter gun vaporized the center of its body. The guardsman fell in 2 unequal pieces, blood steaming where it struck the hot armor of the Baneblade. Behind the center, the super-heavy spearhead received its order. Imperial Command had waited until the Orcs committed enough armor to the breach. Now Baneblades, Storm Swords, and supporting Rogel Dawns began moving forward through prepared lanes, while Warhound Titans stepped beside them. Their advance was slow, deliberate, and murderous. Baneblade cannons fired into battle wagons at ranges where misses became difficult. Demolisher shells collapsed stomper legs. Stormsword siege cannons tore craters through packed Orc formations large enough to bury whole mobs. A Warhound's plasma blast gun discharged and turned a section of battlefield into white fire, vaporizing boys, armor, and wreckage together. The Imperial spearhead pushed into the Orc center, and for the first time that day, the greenskin advance recoiled. That was when Ghazghkull entered Mannheim. He came through the smoke surrounded by meganobs, his personal mob walking into super-heavy fire as though approaching an argument. Mork's Roar opened first. The weapon hammered vision slits, exposed weapon stations and track assemblies in a continuous storm. A Rogel Dawn lost its commander when the cupola disappeared beneath impacts. A Baneblade's forward heavy bolter mount was torn apart. 2 crewmen inside shredded by fragments driven backward through the compartment. Gaz did not waste fire against frontal armor where Imperial machines were strongest. He advanced along their flanks, using Rex and his own bodyguard to close the distance. Meganobs died around him. A Baneblade shell struck among them and threw 4 armored bodies apart. Ghazghkull emerged from the blast and reached the side of a storm sword. Gork's claw bit into the track assembly. Metal screamed. The storm sword tried to turn, but Gaz tore away an entire section of track and drive wheel. The tank settled sideways into the ash. He moved along the hull, while its secondary weapons fired too high to reach him. Mork's roar ripped apart an exposed sponson gunner. Gaz slammed the claw into the side armor, withdrew, struck again, and opened a wound in the vehicle large enough for fire to spill through. Meganobs swarmed the breach. The compartment inside became a furnace of shooter fire, power claws, and screaming crewmen. A loader tried to crawl through an upper hatch, and Gaz caught him around the waist. The claw closed. The man's armor, pelvis, and spine collapsed together, and what remained fell back inside the tank. The disciplined Imperial counterattack became mechanical slaughter. Warhounds fired into Gaz's bodyguard. Super heavies reversed while trying to bring main weapons to bear. Orcs climbed onto hulls, smashing optics and cutting at hatches. Gaz moved through it all, damaged but relentless, turning one crippled tank into cover against another and driving his mob deeper into the formation. A Baneblade fired its demolisher cannon at almost suicidal range. The shell struck near Gaz and lifted him from the ground. He disappeared beneath smoke. For several seconds, even the orcs nearest him stopped. Then, blue armored vehicles came through the eastern haze. Ven saw Ghazghkull for the first time through the targeting optics of an Ultramarines repulsor executioner. The image did not match the scale his mind expected. He had seen picked captures and tactical projections. None conveyed what the orc looked like moving among tanks. "Primary target confirmed," Ven said. "Armored elements, concentrate fire on the Prophet's bodyguard. Do not close individually." Gladiator Lancers fired first. Lascannon beams crossed the field and killed Meganobs outright, punching through armor and detonating ammunition within. Repulsor weapons followed. Heavy bolters and Gatling cannons scythed through lesser orcs, trying to reinforce Gaz. The Prophet himself took a Lascannon strike across the chest that burst part of his armor open and spun him half around. He did not fall. A Redemptor dreadnought advanced past Ven's position. Its macroplasma incinerator glowed white-blue. "Target acquired," the dreadnought voxed. "Brother, maintain distance," Ven ordered. The Redemptor fired. Plasma struck Ghazghkull's left shoulder and erupted across his armor. Plates glowed. Cabling burned away. Flesh beneath blackened. Gaz roared, this time not with joy but pain, and charged the dreadnought. The Redemptor fired again and missed as Gaz moved behind a wrecked Russ. Its heavy onslaught Gatling cannon tore through the wreckage after him. Gaz emerged at close range. The dreadnought swung its power fist and hit him squarely in the torso. The impact broke armor plates, drove Gaz backward, and forced him to one knee. Ven allowed himself one heartbeat of hope. Gaz rose. Gork's claw caught the Redemptor's plasma weapon arm at the elbow. The powered pincers closed and tore through ceramite, adamantium reinforcement and cabling. The arm came away in a shower of sparks. The dreadnought struck again with its fist, crushing part of Gaz's shoulder guard and drawing more blood. Gaz stepped inside the next blow. He drove the claw into the front armor, not through the thickest plate, but into the seam beside the sarcophagus housing. The power field screamed. Armor peeled outward. The Redemptor fired point blank from its remaining secondary weapons, rounds hammering Gaz's chest and face. He kept pulling. The sarcophagus housing opened. The ancient warrior inside died beneath Gork's claw before Ven could reach him. "Withdraw by squads," Ven ordered. His voice remained level, because discipline was what remained when anger had nowhere useful to go. "Armor first, infantry cover, Mark the dreadnought for recovery denial. Charges were placed remotely. The Redemptor's wreck exploded seconds after Gaz stepped away from it. The blast finally knocked the Prophet down. Mechs reached him before the smoke cleared. They swarmed his armor with hammers, welding torches and replacement plates, while the battle continued around them. One climbed onto Gaz's back, struck a damaged servo housing twice and shouted, "Boss, left actuators proper mangled." Gaz turned his head. "Fix it. Need time." Gaz looked toward the next Imperial line, already visible through the smoke. "Fix it before I get there." The mech stared at him, then began hammering faster. The Imperials did not collapse. They withdrew. Varric's surviving chimeras moved first through pre-marked lanes, while infantry remounted under covering fire. Ven's Astartes held the flanks, bolt weapons cutting down orcs attempting pursuit. Remote charges detonated beneath abandoned vehicles and collapsed sections of roadway. Minefields left untouched during the opening assault were activated behind the retreating force. Basilisks shifted to denial fire, walking shells across the ground the Imperials had just surrendered. Entire mobs disappeared beneath the barrage. A Stomper entered a demolition zone and vanished inside the detonation of buried Prometheum reserves. The withdrawal cost Ghazghkull thousands of boys, hundreds of vehicles and more meganobs than some war bosses possessed in total. He took Mannheim anyway. By nightfall, the gap was burning from horizon to horizon. Corpses lay so thickly in some places that vehicles drove over them without touching earth. Imperial wrecks burned beside orc wrecks. Titan carcasses from older wars watched over fresh dead. The first defensive line was gone, but secondary positions still stood farther east. Makari found Ghazghkull atop the broken hull of a Baneblade, while mechs continued welding armor onto him. The Prophet looked beyond Mannheim toward the distant Hive lights. "Humies fought good," Makari said. Gaz gave a low grunt. "They'll fight harder tomorrow." "Yeah." Makari looked at the captured ground. "We won, Den." Ghazghkull stared east for a long time. Then he laughed quietly. "They still think I'm trying to win." Makari frowned. Gaz looked toward the deeper war zones of Armageddon, where new armies were already moving because Mannheim had fallen. Good. The equatorial jungle did not resemble the ash wastes, except in the number of ways it could kill a man. There the horizon vanished completely, replaced by walls of vegetation swollen on poisoned rain and generations of industrial runoff. Trees rose from black mud on trunks broader than hab block supports, their bark furred with pale fungal growths that released clouds of spores when disturbed. Carnivorous creepers looped between branches. Pools of chemical runoff steamed beneath mats of algae, the color of infected flesh. The air was hot enough to make sweat gather beneath sealed uniforms within minutes, yet no guardsman dared break his rebreather seal. Armageddon's jungle breathed poison. It also swallowed machines. Chimeras that could race across open ash were confined to old logging roads, Manufacturum service tracks, and ferrocrete causeways, half reclaimed by roots. Lehman Russ crews could see barely 50 meters through the foliage. Vox signals scattered against moisture, ore deposits, and industrial ruins buried beneath the canopy.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
Every meter of advance required auspex sweeps, mine checks, and men staring into shadows that seemed to move whenever they looked away. The Steel Legion hated fighting there. Boss Snickrot understood why. He lay motionless beneath the fronds of a poisonous broadleaf plant, while an Imperial patrol passed less than 6 meters away. The guardsmen did everything they had been taught. They moved in pairs. The point man carried an auspex. The rear trooper watched behind. Their laser guns remained raised rather than slung, muzzles covering likely firing positions. Each wore sealed greatcoat, gloves, goggles, and rebreather. They avoided the obvious trail, stepped over trip routes, and stopped twice to inspect branches that looked disturbed. They were veterans, and that was why Snickrot had chosen them. His commandos waited around the patrol without moving. One was submerged to the mouth in a drainage ditch filled with foul green water. Another hung beneath a fallen industrial pipe, where camouflage netting broke the outline of his shoulders. 2 more were above the guardsmen, flattened along branches so thick they could support a sentinel. Their armor had been blackened with ash, mud, and fungus paste until metal no longer reflected light. Red skull glyphs were painted where only another orc would notice them. Sluggers had been crudely suppressed. Stick bombs were wrapped to stop them knocking against armor. Choppers had been dulled where polished edges might flash through the undergrowth. Snickrot carried Mork's teeth across his back, both blades darkened and wet from the patrol that had traveled this route before. The point guardsman paused. His auspex clicked. Snickrot raised. 1 finger. Nobody attacked. The man turned slowly, scanning foliage. Another click. A third. The guardsman whispered, "Contact uncertainty. Bearing left." His section leader answered through the squad vox. "Confirm." Negative confirmation. They waited. Somewhere deeper in the jungle, a bird-like thing screamed. The auspex settled. The guardsman exhaled and moved. Snickrot lowered his finger. The patrol passed untouched. That was worse. 3 hours later, the same men found the missing patrol from the previous night sitting upright against a row of trees. 8 corpses had been arranged carefully enough that they appeared to be resting until the searchlights found the blood. Their identification tags were gone. Their weapons were gone. Their boots had been removed. Each corpse had been opened from throat to pelvis with the same narrow blade. Nothing had been taken from inside them. Snickrot had not needed trophies. He needed men to see what could be done without waking the sentries less than 200 meters away. By the next watch, nobody inside Relay Fortress Vardos slept properly. The fortress was not large by Armageddon standards. Its importance came from what passed through it. Hardened data trunks beneath the jungle floor linked supply depots west of the equatorial belt to transport coordination stations feeding Hive death mire. Munitorum schedules, convoy routes, artillery allotments, fuel transfers and ammunition releases moved through cogitator arrays sunk deep inside the fortress. Operation Imperator used the same network to coordinate Astartes strike windows with Steel Legion ground offensives. The walls were ferrocrete and plasteel, built around an older industrial pumping station whose drainage arteries remained beneath the foundations. Heavy bolters covered the approaches. Searchlights swept the jungle. Auspex masts rotated above the canopy. Trip mines had been laid in overlapping arcs outside the perimeter. Flamers were positioned at vehicle gates in case orcs reached the wire. The defenders had heard of Snickrot. That knowledge became another weapon. A sentry fired at movement beyond the eastern floodlights and emptied half a laspack into a tree before anyone identified the target as hanging vines. An autocannon crew fired 3 bursts at a heat signature that proved to be a chemical vent. Twice the fortress alarm sounded because somebody heard guttural speech on the vox. The first time it was static. The second time it was not. "Third patrol, report," Lieutenant Harl Creven ordered from the command bunker. The reply came through distortion. "Route clear, returning by southern approach." Creven frowned. The patrol had been ordered to the north. "Identify." Static. "Third patrol, identify." A voice answered, clipped and awkward. "Route clear." Every man in the bunker stared at the Vox unit. Then came laughter. Low, wet, brief. The transmission ended. Creven ordered all patrols recalled and doubled the perimeter watch. That was what Snickrot wanted. Guardsmen who had been moving through the jungle were brought behind walls. Searchlights swept faster. Heavy weapons stayed manned. Men watched until their eyes hurt and drank stimulant concentrate to keep themselves awake. The fortress became safer and weaker at the same time. Nobody outside it was left to watch the drainage gullies. The first commando entered through water. A rusted maintenance grate beneath the southern wall had been welded closed decades before. The Red Skull reached it under the surface, worked a narrow cutter between two corroded bars, and took almost half an hour removing enough metal to pass. He never surfaced. A breathing hose made from scavenged Imperial tubing ran beneath the mud behind him. Others followed. They crawled through darkness on elbows and knees, while effluent pressed around their bodies. Snickrot came sixth. The drain opened beneath an abandoned filtration chamber. One sentry stood outside the sealed interior door. Snickrot waited until the man turned his head toward a burst of gunfire beyond the wall. The suppressed slug entered beneath the base of the skull. The guardsman jerked once, struck the bulkhead with his shoulder, and began sliding downward. Snickrot caught him before his armor scraped against metal. He lowered the body gently. The commandos spread through the fortress. No roar announced them. A guardsman standing beside an ammunition. Elevator felt a hand close over his rebreather, and a blade enter beneath his ribs. Snickrot pushed upward until Mork's tooth found the heart, held the man while his boots kicked weakly against the deck, then eased him into a maintenance recess. Another sentry disappeared from a firing step when a commando seized his greatcoat and pulled him backward into darkness. His replacement found only one severed glove and a smear of blood beneath the parapet. The eastern bunker remained on the Vox throughout its own destruction. Command, east position, movement inside perimeter. Creven snatched the receiver. Strength? Unknown. One shadow. A suppressed shot coughed. What was that? No answer. Then screaming. The bunker crew fought room by room. A heavy bolter gunner turned the weapon inward and fired along the access corridor, mass reactive shells tearing one commando apart and punching holes through two walls behind him. Another orc came through a side maintenance hatch and buried a chopper in the loader's spine. The man folded over backward as the blade split vertebrae. The gunner swung the heavy bolter around and was caught by the jaw. Green fingers closed over his lower face and tore sideways. Bones snapped. His tongue and teeth came away with the flesh. The Vox remained open while he drowned in blood. East bunker, report! A guardsman staggered into the transmission alcove with one arm hanging by strips of muscle. They're inside. Throne. They're inside. Something moved behind him. He turned. A blade entered through the side of his neck and emerged beneath the opposite ear. The transmission continued for 7 seconds after his body hit the floor. By the time the fortress understood the attack was real, the Red Skulls had already reached the inner cogitator levels. Brother Sergeant Castor Venn entered the jungle aboard a Thunderhawk that could not find a clear place to land. The gunship hovered above a service road while trees hammered beneath its thrusters, then dropped its assault ramp without touching ground. Venn and his ultramarines descended into waist-high vegetation. The Thunderhawk rose immediately, disappearing through canopy under sporadic orc fire. Venn disliked the battlefield within 30 seconds. His armor made him stronger than anything human in the jungle, and more visible than almost anything alive within it. Branches caught against his pauldrons. Dense foliage reduced his bolt rifle's effective engagement distance to the length of a manufacturum corridor. Heat signatures overlapped in his helm display. Spores clung to optics. Roots large enough to stop a chimera forced the squad into predictable channels. Formation tight, he ordered. No pursuit beyond mutual support. Mortal auxiliaries remain centered. A Steel Legion lieutenant beside him nodded. Snickrot wants us off the road. Then we remain where he does not want us. They advanced toward Vardos. Navigation marker 7 was missing. Marker 8 had been turned around. The lieutenant swore beneath his breath. They altered the route. Venn looked at the cut bolts on the mounting bracket. Recently, a shot struck the rear guardsman in the throat. The column reacted instantly. Laser guns and bolters covered the trees. Nothing moved. Venn saw a heat smear for less than a second and fired. His bolt round entered a trunk and detonated inside wood. Do not fire without confirmation. A scream came from farther left. 2 guardsmen broke formation toward it. Hold. One obeyed. The other reached the vegetation and vanished. There was no prolonged struggle, only a wet chopping sound. Ven advanced 3 steps, acquired a shape through thermal haze, and fired twice. The first bolt struck a Red Skull commando through the shoulder. The second entered the chest. The orc exploded backward into foliage, rib fragments and blackened blood coating the leaves. Confirmed kill, Ven said. One commando. He knew that was exactly the exchange Snickrot wanted. The fortress came into view through smoke. Its eastern wall was still intact. The western gate was burning. Bodies lay along the firing steps. Some had been shot. Others had been cut apart so violently that Ven's armor struggled to assign individual remains to individual men. One defender had been dragged across a wall of razor wire after death, leaving strips of greatcoat and flesh. Hanging from the coils, the Ultramarines entered at speed. Squad Pelion, Command Bunker, Squad Ven, Cogitator levels. Steel Legion secures the gate. Nobody pursues outside perimeter. The commandos were already withdrawing. That did not mean they fled cleanly. Ven found 3 around the main data chamber. The first fired a suppressed slug that flattened against his breastplate. Ven shot him through the face. The detonation removed the back of the orc's skull. The second charged with a chopper, fast enough to reach him before he could fire again. Ven caught the wrist, broke it, and drove his combat blade through the orc's throat. The third threw a stick bomb. Ven turned his pauldron toward the blast and felt fragments hammer armor. By the time he recovered, the commando had vanished through a service door. He did not follow. The data chamber had been opened. Cogitator housings stood gutted. Brass memory spindles had been removed. Crude orc cables connected an Imperial tactical reader to a portable greenskin device that should not have been compatible with it, and nevertheless had been. A dead Gretchen lay beside the machine with electrical burns covering half its body. The Steel Legion lieutenant stared at the missing components. They stole data. Ven looked at the open maintenance shafts beneath the floor. No, they stole roots. Explosions began below them, not in the walls, under the fortress. Snickrot had planted charges along the buried data trunks before the assault began. The first detonation severed the Deathmire supply coordination line. The second destroyed the Western Depot relay. The third opened a service tunnel beneath the command bunker and dropped half the structure into darkness. Ven was thrown against a cogitator bank. Warning runes flooded his visor. "Evacuate," he ordered. "All forces, immediate withdrawal." The fortress died beneath them. Ferrocrete cracked. Antennae toppled. Fires moved through cable conduits. Men ran for the gates, while Red Skull commandos fired from the jungle at anyone who became separated. Ven saw one and put a bolt through its chest. Another disappeared before he could acquire it. Snickrot watched from beneath the canopy. He had lost commandos. That mattered. It did not matter enough to remain. The map plates were already gone. Fuel depots, ammunition stockpiles, convoy staging grounds, alternative routes prepared for Operation Imperator. He gave 2 hand signals. The Red Skulls vanished deeper into the jungle. By sunset, Relay Fortress Vardos was a burning crater with a surviving Vox mast leaning above it. Calgar received the first complete report hours later. Mannheim, the Speedoir, attacks, the lost relay. Teleporter strikes behind secured positions. He laid the reports beside one another and saw the design emerging. Ghazghkull was not using orcs as one weapon. He was using each kind of orc as the weapon it already wanted to be. Speed freaks broke roads. Commandos broke certainty. Meganobs broke armor. Mobs broke whatever remained. A fresh data fragment arrived from the surviving Vardos cogitator cores. It showed orc movements across the southern approaches. The numbers were immense. Columns converged toward Hive Deathmire from multiple axes. Infantry, armor, speed freaks, artillery, gargant elements. Every officer in the strategium reached the same conclusion. Deathmire was Ghazghkull's next objective. On Armageddon, Yarrick studied the same projection. He did not speak for several seconds. Varric stood nearby. "You disagree?" Yarrick looked at the red lines. "No." Varric waited. Yarrick's augmetic eye glowed against the hololith. "I think Ghazghkull wants us to agree." Hive death mire had grown swollen with the living and the dying, until its lower districts resembled the gut of some diseased iron god that had swallowed an army and could no longer digest it. Refugee laborers slept beneath transit arches beside ammunition pallets. Wounded guardsmen filled Manufactorum annexes, whose production lines still hammered out replacement track links and shell casings above rows of field cots. Servitors carried bloodied surgical instruments through corridors where Munitorum adepts shouted over Vox traffic, and tank crews slept sitting upright against stacks of battle cannon rounds because there was nowhere else to lie. Beyond the Hive proper, the Tempestor Victorum defensive line had been raised and rebuilt until the distinction between fortress and battlefield had almost ceased to exist. Macro bunkers squatted beneath layers of ferrocrete and compacted ash. Trenches ran through kill zones pre-measured by artillery officers. Mine belts stretched across approach roads and crater fields. Hydra batteries waited beneath camouflage netting beside manticore launchers, and basilisk positions dug deep enough that only their gun shields showed above the earth. Tank revetments broke the ground into angular scars. Fortified transit ways connected the outer line to the Hive gates, so infantry and ammunition could move without being exposed to the poisonous wind. Every position had secondary firing points behind it, and demolition charges beneath those. Hive death mire had not been prepared to survive. It had been prepared to make its death expensive. Sebastian Yarrick walked the Tempestor Victorum line with the slow, mechanical stiffness of a man whose body had been repaired too many times to remember what painless movement felt like. Cold air entered through his rebreather and tasted of filtration chemicals. Beneath his greatcoat, scar tissue around old augmentic interfaces pulled whenever he turned. One leg occasionally lost sensation without warning. The fingers of his remaining natural hand had begun trembling after too many hours without rest, though he kept them closed around the edge of his coat whenever officers approached. His power claw hung at his side, immense and ugly, its hydraulics whispering with each step. Nobody mentioned his pace. Nobody offered him assistance twice. The first aide who suggested medici rest had been ignored. The second had received a look that ended the conversation so completely that the man had not spoken again for almost an hour. Yarrick stopped beside a tactical slate mounted inside an armored command shelter. Colonel Harven, commander of one of the line regiments, pointed toward 3 reserve formations. "We can distribute them evenly behind the primary sectors. That gives every breach point immediate reinforcement." "No." Harven hesitated. "Commissar, Ghazghkull does not attack every weakness. He attacks one until it becomes the only weakness that matters." Yarrick moved 2 reserve markers away from the southern line and placed them behind the central transport artery. "Keep these mobile. No commitment without confirmation. That leaves the southern works thin. They are supposed to look thin." Harven studied him. Yarrick met the stare with his natural eye. "If the orcs believe they have found weakness, they will concentrate. If they concentrate, artillery kills them. And if they break through, then the reserve kills what survives." The colonel nodded slowly. "Understood." Yarrick moved on. Major Ren Varric's remaining Steel Legion cohort occupied one of those mobile reserve positions inside a ruined freight depot 3 kilometers behind the outer line. The formation no longer looked like a regiment. It looked like a salvage yard someone had ordered to fight. Chimeras bore mismatched side plates welded over old penetrations. One transport had a rear hatch from another vehicle painted in a different campaign scheme. A Lehman Russ attached after Mannheim carried an entire left track guard cut from a wreck and bolted into place without repainting. Another tank had lost its original command cupola and received a crude replacement surrounded by blast scoring. Men slept inside the vehicles beside ammunition because unloading the crates would cost time they might not have before the next order. They ate ration paste, sitting on benches still stained with somebody else's blood. Rebreathers remained around their necks, even while inside the depot, because bombardment had cracked the roof in several places, and toxic air seeped through the structure whenever the wind changed. Varric sat inside his command chimera, while an engine seer half disappeared beneath the floor plates. "Motive Unit 3 is failing," the tech priest said, voice layered beneath static. "Can it move?" "Yes." "Then it is not failing yet." The engine seer's mechadendrite emerged from the opening and pointed accusingly at him. "The machine spirit is distressed." "So am I." The engine seer made a Binharic sound that might have been disapproval. A distant rumble passed through the depot. Men stopped eating. The rumble became engines. Varric climbed through the command hatch and raised his magnoculars toward the western approaches. The horizon moved. Ghazghkull hit Tempestor Victorum at full speed. Warbikes flooded the outer flats in red and black streams, exhaust plumes mixing with artillery smoke, until the ground looked as though it had caught fire beneath them. Buggies raced among the bikes, suspension breaking and rebounding over craters, while exposed gunners fired at anything ahead. Ghazghkull skimmed above the formation beneath Orc aircraft that came shrieking through Imperial anti-air fire. Their opening attack was not subtle. It was velocity made into doctrine. Orc artillery pounded the line without concern for accuracy, while fighter bombers dived toward Hydra positions. Smoke shells burst across minefields. Burning wrecks from the first vehicles were immediately used as visual cover by those behind them. The Imperial guns waited. Yarrick had ordered that no outer artillery open before the speed freaks entered the pre-sighted zones. Warbikes crossed the first range marker. Nothing happened. They crossed the second. Ghazghkull's laughter came over unsecured channels. Then the ground disappeared beneath them. Basilisk batteries fired in massed concentration. Earthshaker shells landed along the marked grids, not chasing individual bikes, but turning entire stretches of terrain into overlapping explosions. Warbikers vanished under pillars of ash. Buggies flipped end over end. A Ghazghkull caught a blast beneath its tail and cartwheeled into a truck, rotor blades cutting 3 boys apart before the fuel ignited. Manticores fired into the deeper concentrations. Missiles descended through the polluted cloud and burst among staging mobs still advancing toward the line. The mine belts began detonating. One bike struck an anti-vehicle charge at such speed that the machine disintegrated around its rider. The Orc's torso crossed nearly 30 meters before striking another warbike. 3 following machines hit the wreck and went down together. Another buggy detonated a mine, rolled onto its side, and continued moving until a second vehicle rammed it from behind. Burning fuel sprayed across both crews. The riders behind them never slowed. "Fire," Yarrick said. Tempestor Victorum erupted. Lascannons struck battle wagons appearing behind the speed freaks. Autocannons stitched fire into Ghazghkull. Heavy bolters swept the ground between mine explosions. Missile teams fired from recessed bunkers and disappeared back beneath cover before Orc gunners could answer. Space Marines held behind the first line until the leading mobs reached the prepared choke points. Then the counterattacks came in short, violent bursts. Ultramarines emerged from transit tunnels, fired disciplined volleys into dismounted boys, and fell back before the next wave could surround them. Black Templars hit one breached trench with chainswords and power weapons, killed everything inside it, and withdrew only after 3 separate Vox orders reminded them the trench was not the objective. Salamanders burned Orcs from a culvert, whose narrow walls turned Prometheum into an enclosed inferno. The boys nearest the flames died immediately. Those behind shoved forward through burning bodies until bolter fire cut them down. For the first time since Mannheim, the Orcs went backward. Imperial officers watched red tactical markers contract. A cheer began somewhere along the central trenches. Varric heard it and disliked the sound. The Speedwar withdrew beyond effective fire, leaving kilometers of burning wreckage across the approach. Ghazghkull reached Ghazghkull in a mood that would have killed most creatures within speaking distance. "Too many Zoggin guns," he snarled, as Big Reva idled beside the Prophet's position. "They got mines everywhere. Big ones, sneaky ones. One took half a wheel off." Ghazghkull looked toward Deathmire. "How many guns?" Ghazghkull blinked. "What? How many?" "Lots." Gaz turned his head. Ghazghkull understood the danger. "Central bits got more. South line fired late. Big guns behind the middle. Hume tanks stayed back till the bikes hit the second ditch. Angels came out of tunnels here, here and here." Ghazghkull looked at the crude map scratched onto armor plate. "Reserves?" Ghazghkull pointed with one thick finger. "There, most of them." Gaz's anger changed. Makari saw it happen. The Prophet had been furious because orcs had died without taking the line. Now he was listening to how they had died. "Good," Gaz said. Ghazghkull stared at him. "Good? Now we know." The warbiker's grin slowly returned. A nearby war boss laughed too loudly. "Speed freaks got shot to bits just to find that out. I could take that wall myself." Gaz looked at him. The boss was called Grubnak Skullcrumper and commanded enough boys to think numbers made him important. "You can?" Grubnak slapped the blade of his chopper against his armor. "Straight at it. No messing about. Boys go in. Wall comes down." Gaz pointed toward the Tempestor Victorum line. "Go on, Den." Grubnak's grin froze. Nobody laughed now. An hour later, Grubnak charged the wall with nearly 20,000 boys. The Imperials killed most of them before they reached it. Artillery struck the advancing mobs at pre-sighted intervals. Heavy bolters cut through packed ranks. Battle cannon fire tore openings large enough that following boys disappeared inside the craters. Those who reached the minefields detonated them with their bodies. Those who reached the walls found firing steps above them, filled with Steel Legion and Astartes. Grubnak survived. He returned without half his warband, armor punctured, one ear missing, and blood running down his neck. "Boys was useless," he snarled. "Woulda had it if they—" Ghazghkull hit him once. Gork's claw closed around Grubnak's torso. The warboss screamed. The claw tightened. Armor folded inward. Ribs cracked loud enough for Makari to hear. Blood ran from Grubnak's mouth. Gaz lifted him off the ground. "They followed you." Grubnak kicked weakly. "Yeah. Then they died 'cause you was stupid." The claw closed completely. Grubnak came apart inside his armor. Gaz dropped the remains. He pointed at the surviving boys. "You lot." The mob stared. Gaz selected the largest knob among them. "Your boss now?" The knob looked at what remained of Grubnak. "Yeah, boss. Go learn Summit." The survivors went back toward the line. By nightfall, the fighting had reached the cloisters. The name belonged to a fortified transit complex built into the outer Hive approach, a maze of arched ferrocrete corridors, loading halls, service tunnels, and raised galleries connecting supply depots to defensive sectors. Space Marines had turned the architecture into a killing machine. Ven's Ultramarines held one of the central passages where the orcs could approach only 6 abreast. Bolter fire filled the corridor with detonations. Boys entered whole and came apart in pieces. Mass reactive shells burst inside torsos, blowing chunks of green flesh across walls already slick with blood. Chainswords screamed whenever ammunition ran low or orcs reached the firing line. Teeth tore through muscle, ribs, and crude armor. One boy caught Ven's blade across the abdomen and remained alive long enough to grab the chainsword casing before the moving teeth ripped through his spine. "Reload by pair," Ven ordered. "Second rank forward." The next orc wave came through smoke and bodies. A Salamander's squad farther east ignited an approach tunnel. Promethium rolled along the ceiling and dropped over the boys beneath. They became running torches. Some continued charging while skin blackened and split. One reached the Imperial line with both eyes cooked opaque before a bolt round opened its skull. The orcs kept learning. The first mobs had charged down the center. The next hugged the walls. The next arrived behind scrap shields. Later, mobs pushed wrecked machinery ahead of them. Still later, commandos appeared through maintenance ducts that Imperial engineers had believed sealed. Every assault failed. Every assault came closer. Yarrick watched the pattern from the central command bunker. The hololith showed corpses only as tactical loss markers, which meant it concealed the truth. He had walked the line. He had seen the ditches filling. Destroyed battle wagons now bridged trenches that had stopped them hours before. Dead boys lay packed across minefields, creating routes behind them. Firing positions revealed themselves every time they killed something. Reserve formations became visible whenever they responded to breaches. Ghazghkull was spending lives to buy geography. Yarrick understood it then. The first assaults had not been failures. They had been measurements. Every dead mob had shown the next mob where to stand. Every destroyed vehicle had shortened the distance. Every barrage had exposed a battery. Every counterattack had revealed a reserve route. Armageddon was teaching Ghazghkull how to kill it. The bunker trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. Another vibration followed, deeper than artillery. Then another. The Vox channels filled with reports from every outer sector. Movement. Not another raid. Not another probing assault. The whole western horizon was advancing. Millions of orcs began roaring beyond the Tempestor Victorum line. The sound reached the Hive as pressure before it became noise. Ferrocrete vibrated. Loose shell casings danced against floors. Wounded men in medici stations looked toward ceilings. Weird green lightning crawled through the poisoned clouds and flashed against the armored windows of command bunkers. Yarrick stood beneath the hololith, while orc contacts multiplied faster than the system could display them. Varick's voice came over the command net. "Commissar, outer line reports mass movement on every principal axis." Yarrick looked at the ceiling as the Hive foundations shook. The roar outside became vast enough to seem like weather. He closed his power claw. "The preliminary attacks are over." The first warning that Gallows Spaceport was about to become a battlefield did not come from the western defense lines. It came from the sky. 3 Dakar jets tore through the toxic cloud cover at such low altitude that their wingtips clipped the upper gantries of an ore processing stack, showering sparks across the ferrocrete apron below. Hydra crews traversed immediately, quad autocannons hammering upward, but the Orc aircraft had already released their first salvo. Crude rockets streaked through the air in crooked lines and struck the anti-air emplacements before the gunners could establish proper leads. One Hydra vanished beneath a blossom of flame, its turret cartwheeling across a maintenance road with the crew still inside. Another lost its ammunition feed, continued firing manually for several seconds, and then exploded when a second Dakar jet stitched the position with cannon fire. The spaceport alarms began wailing across every concourse and loading tower while aircraft were still taxiing. Munitorum crews were still moving ammunition from freight lifters, and whole companies of wounded men were still being transferred from the Hive approaches. Gallows Spaceport had been built to move armies, not defend itself against one. Its runways stretched for kilometers through industrial districts. Cargo spires rose above sealed landing fields. Subterranean fuel lines fed promethium directly into waiting transports. Armored rail entered beneath the eastern terminal and emerged again beneath the western warehouses. Tens of thousands of men, servitors and machines moved through it every hour, all of them tied to Hive death mire by schedules so complex that losing even a single loading district caused delays across half the defensive network. The Dakar jets were only the first layer. Fighter bombers came behind them, slower and heavier, their engines coughing black smoke as they released bombs over the command towers. Defcopters skimmed between radar masts and stabbed rockets into Vox arrays, targeting observation posts and fire control positions instead of wasting ammunition on whatever happened to be closest. Ground crews stared upward at the chaos and almost missed the first warbikers appearing along the Western Service roads. They came beneath the traversal arcs of several defense guns, engines screaming as they threaded between warehouses, fuel pipes and parked haulers. Trucks followed at impossible speed, sides overloaded with boys that fired into windows and loading bays as they passed. The first vehicles that reached the outer maintenance zones did not stop. They rammed through barriers, disgorged orcs from the rear, and kept moving into the next district. Commandos surfaced from drainage culverts and fuel inspection shafts inside positions that had never registered external contact. One squad emerged beneath an ammunition lift, cut down the operators with suppressed sluggers, then planted charges around the control mechanisms before anyone on the upper deck understood the machinery had been compromised. To Imperial officers following the Auspex, the attack looked like disorder. To anyone who survived long enough to see the pattern, it was layered violence. Aircraft broke the eyes, Defcopters broke command, bikes broke reaction time, trucks flooded the gaps, commandos cut whatever remained behind the defense. Major Ren Varric received the reinforcement order while his cohort was still refueling behind Deathmire's secondary line. He read the destination once, looked at the half-repaired chimeras around him and said, "Mount." No one asked whether the vehicles were ready. Readiness had become a word used by clerks. Engines coughed alive. Track units began turning before ammunition crates were fully secured. A Lehman Russ with replacement road wheels taken from two separate wrecks joined the column with one sponson still unresponsive. Varric's command Chimera left the depot at full speed, and the rest followed, moving toward Gallows through industrial arteries, already crowded with retreating transports and Munitorum convoys. Vox channels carried conflicting orders, panicked requests for escorts, warnings of Orc aircraft, and constant casualty reports. Varric ignored everything not directly connected to his route. Column stays closed. Do not stop for disabled civilian traffic. Russ section covers crossings. Top gunners watch high and rear. If a bike gets alongside, kill the rider before the machine. The driver glanced toward the tactical display. "Sir, western route is red." Varric tightened his rebreather straps. "Then we use it before the Orcs do." They met Ghazghkull's column on a raised industrial causeway, wide enough for 6 chimeras abreast. Orc bikes came through the smoke ahead, weaving between burning cargo carriers while their guns spat fire. The leading Lehman Russ fired on the move and struck a war buggy head-on, battle cannon shell entering beneath the front plate and detonating inside the engine block. The wreck flipped sideways, clipped 2 bikes, and filled the roadway with burning debris. The Steel Legion did not slow. Chimeras drove through the wreckage while top hatches opened and guardsmen fired laser guns at arm's length into Orcs racing beside them. One warbiker leapt from his machine and landed on a transport's roof, chopper already raised. A Steel Legion gunner fired a last burst through the Orc's jaw, but the creature remained upright long enough to bury its weapon in the gunner's shoulder. Another guardsman seized the Orc from behind and emptied a hot-shot pistol into the base of its skull until green-black blood sprayed across the hatch rim. The body slid under the Chimera's tracks and vanished. Farther ahead, a buggy rammed the side of a Lehman Russ, and its crew tried to climb onto the engine deck. The Russ commander rotated the turret, while another tank fired heavy bolters across his hull, mass reactive shells tearing the borders apart so close that pieces of Orc remained stuck inside the exhaust grills. Then, Big Reva appeared. Ghazghkull came through the road battle like speed given a body. The warbike had already lost armor from the fighting at Tempestor Victorum, and replacement plates had been welded over the damage without matching the original shape. That only made it look faster. Its engine screamed at a pitch that hurt through Varric's Vox dampers. The Psycho Gatler opened fire while Ghazghkull was still more than 100 meters away, rounds carving through the Steel Legion column from the flank. One Chimera's top gunner vanished from the waist up. Another transport took repeated impacts along the side, until armor ruptured inward and filled the troop compartment with metal splinters and detonating ammunition. Varric watched the bike disappear behind a warehouse support, expected it to emerge on the far side, and saw nothing. His auspex flickered. Static flooded the tactical screen. A green flash tore open the roadway behind the column. Big Reva reappeared inside the Imperial formation. Ghazghkull laughed so loudly, his voice distorted across every unsecured channel. "Too slow, Humies." The Psycho Gatler tore through an autocannon team before the men could rotate their weapon. Bodies burst across the emplacement. One crewman was cut in half at the waist and remained gripping the firing handles, while his lower body collapsed separately behind him. Ghazghkull drove through the blood without slowing. A Chimera attempted to turn across the lane and block him. Big Reva's grabber-dragger fired.
The hooked mechanism catching the rear armor. The bike accelerated. The transport lurched sideways, track assembly screaming against the road, and was dragged into the path of another Imperial vehicle. Both collided hard enough to throw infantry from open hatches. Ghazghkull released the hook, hit the accelerator, and vanished between cargo stacks before the Steel Legion guns could traverse. "Do not chase him," Varric ordered. "Objective is Gallows." That was the only reason half the column survived. By the time they reached the outer spaceport districts, Gallows had become a vertical war. Orcs fought across landing pads, while Imperial aircraft attempted emergency takeoff between streams of tracer fire. One Valkyrie lifted 10 meters before a rocket struck its port engine. The craft rolled into a cargo gantry, broke apart, and fell into the concourse below, trailing burning fuel. Guardsmen ran beneath it. Some made it. Others disappeared beneath the wreckage. Above them, Def-Copter circled control spires, while heavy stubbers and autocannons fired from every direction. Below ground, commandos moved through fuel tunnels and maintenance channels, cutting pipes and opening sealed hatches for following mobs. A cargo lift large enough to carry a battle tank rose from the lower levels packed with boys. The platform reached the upper apron, and the orcs charged before the doors were fully open. Heavy bolters killed the front ranks, but the dead piled high enough that the next mob climbed over them and reached the firing line. Varric's Steel Legion entered through the eastern freight avenue and tried to turn chaos back into geometry. Chimeras form on the terminal wall. Russes hold central approach. Dismount only inside the cargo lanes. Keep the runways open for withdrawal. His men obeyed because there was nothing else to do. Multi-lasers swept loading bays. Heavy bolters hammered trucks crossing open apron. Melter gunners waited behind refueling stations and burned battle wagons through side armor when they passed. The fighting contracted into brutal distances. Orcs charged between stacks of cargo containers. Guardsmen fired from under vehicles. One Nob smashed through a loading office wall with a power claw, grabbed a Steel Legion trooper around the torso, and closed the weapon. Flak armor crumpled with the body inside it. Blood and ruptured organs spilled across the Nob's forearm. The guardsman beside him fired a melter gun into the orc's face. There was no face afterward. The sky above the central complex darkened beneath a Thunderhawk. Brother Sergeant Castor Venn stood at the assault ramp before the gunship had fully settled into hover. Objective Central Control. Do not disperse. Mortal forces are already withdrawing through the eastern concourse. We stabilize the line and preserve the route. The ramp opened into gunfire. Venn jumped. His boots struck ferrocrete hard enough to crack it. His squad descended behind him and began firing before the Thunderhawk withdrew. Their arrival changed the shape of the battle immediately. Boys accustomed to terrified human defenders ran into disciplined bolter volleys instead. Venn fired twice into the first orc and moved to the second before the mass reactive shells detonated inside the first creature's chest. Brother Pelion destroyed a charging Nob with 3 rounds placed into throat, sternum, and pelvis. A fourth Ultramarine fired into a truck driver, then into the fuel tank when the vehicle slewed sideways. The explosion killed the boys still riding in the rear. Advance 10 meters, hold junction. The squad advanced. Left gallery. Bolters rose together. Fire. The gallery became a slaughterhouse. Orcs died against the railings, some falling intact, others dropping in pieces. Ven did not waste ammunition on bodies already failing. He assessed, fired, shifted. The Ultramarines pushed far enough to reconnect 3 isolated Steel Legion positions, and then stopped. They did not pursue the mob withdrawing toward the western hangars. The Black Templars arriving on the adjoining concourse did. Their chainswords roared as they drove into the Orcs, beneath shouted praises to the God Emperor. A Templar with a power sword split one boy from shoulder to hip and struck the next before the first body opened fully. Another advanced through shooter fire with bolts sparking from black ceramite and crushed an Orc's skull beneath his boot. They forced. The greenskins back through 2 loading galleries before Ven's Vox channel carried the first warning from Orbital Command. Imperator elements. Enemy command presence confirmed approaching Gallows. Ven knew what that meant before the name followed. Ghazghkull Thraka. The change in the Orcs came before Ghazghkull himself entered view. Boys who had been retreating stopped. Knobs began hitting them forward. Warbikers turned back toward the central terminal. The roar spread from one concourse to another until even the Astartes could feel it through their armor. Ven had experienced the psychic weight of Wah energy before, but this was different in intensity. It was as if an entire army had drawn breath at once. Ghazghkull walked into Gallows Spaceport beneath burning aircraft. Mork's roar began firing. The first burst emptied an upper gallery of guardsmen. Men disappeared behind impacts that shattered railings, ferrocrete and bodies together. One Steel Legion officer was thrown over the edge without his left arm. Another remained standing against the wall because shell fragments had nailed his coat to the metal behind him after his torso opened. Gaz advanced through return fire while boys surged around him. Plasma struck his chest and burned a glowing wound through replacement armor. A Lascannon hit one shoulder and blasted plating away. He staggered, roared, and kept moving. Every wound seemed to make the Orcs around him more violent. "Concentrate fire," Ven ordered. "Do not attempt single combat." Ultramarines fired by squad. Bolter rounds struck Gaz's armor. Plasma burned exposed cabling. A power weapon carried by Lieutenant Marius Dravian cut through the outer plating of Gork's claw and severed a hydraulic feed. Gaz responded with a backhanded blow that threw the lieutenant across the concourse. Dravian struck a support pillar hard enough to crack ceramite, rose anyway, and charged again. "Lieutenant, withdraw!" Dravian ignored the order long enough to reach Gaz a second time. His power sword drove into the Prophet's side. Gaz looked down. For one instant, the Orc seemed almost surprised. Then Gork's claw closed around Dravian. Ceramite compressed. The lieutenant screamed once. The claw tightened further. Armor cracked inward around ribs and organs. Blood burst from seals at the waist and neck. Gaz lifted the broken Astartes and hurled him through a firing station, scattering metal, glass, and pieces of the dead Marine across the floor. Ven fired into Gaz's exposed side until his magazine ran empty. "Sergeant!" Calgar's voice came over the command channel, cold and unmistakable. "Preserve combat strength. Gallows is no longer defensible. Withdraw by planned corridors." Ven looked west. Black Templars were still fighting in the loading galleries. "Templar elements, disengage. Withdrawal order confirmed." The Marshal answered through heavy static. "The foe stands before us. The objective is lost. Then we shall make him pay for it. You will make him pay elsewhere if you survive." Silence followed. Then the Templar replied, "Acknowledged. We withdraw when our wounded are clear." It was not the exact order. It was close enough for war. The Imperial retreat began in stages. Steel Legion vehicles reversed through the eastern freight avenues, while Astartes covered intersections. Demolition charges destroyed fuel junctions behind them. Thunderhawks descended into smoke long enough to recover wounded squads, rising again under streams of Orc fire. Varek's chimeras carried more men than their compartments were designed for. One transport moved with guardsmen clinging to the roof,
until Deathcopter fire tore 3 of them away. Ven remained at the final junction until every mortal unit he could see had passed. Gaz did not pursue him. The Prophet had reached the upper landing platforms. By nightfall, Gallows' Spaceport belonged to the Orcs. Burning aircraft lay across runways. Cargo towers smoldered. Ammunition bunkers continued detonating beneath the terminals, each blast sending fragments of metal and bodies across the captured complex. Boys looted weapons they did not understand. Mechs already crawled over Imperial machines, arguing about what could be made faster or louder. Wazdaka rode circles around the highest platform until Gaz told him to stop. Makari climbed onto a ruined loading. Gantry beside the Prophet. Below them, Gallows burned. Beyond it lay Hive Death Mire. The Spaceport had been one of the Hive's great arteries. Men, armor, shells, fuel, and aircraft had moved through it without pause. Now nothing moved east unless the Orcs allowed it. Makari looked at Gaz. "We got it." "Yeah. Humies'll want it back." Ghazghkull stared toward the Hive lights. A low laugh came from inside his armor. "That's why we took it." Gallows' Spaceport did not become quiet after the guns stopped. It simply changed the kind of noise it made. Makari followed Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka through the captured industrial districts beneath the constant thunder of hammers, cutting torches, revving engines, and shouted arguments as the Wah consumed what the Imperium had left behind. Every street had become a workshop. Every wreck had become a resource. Steel Legion chimeras that had carried men into battle the previous day now stood on blocks, while mechs tore armor from their hulls and welded gun mounts across their roofs. A Lehman Russ, without a turret, had been converted into the foundation of a crude gun wagon, its engine deck cut open so 3 Orcs could fit around a power plant never intended to survive their attentions. Burning Thunderhawk wreckage was being stripped for adamantium, cabling and avionics by Gretchen, who climbed over still hot metal with sacks across their backs. Fuel lines beneath the Spaceport had been breached and redirected through hoses, pipes and lengths of scavenged conduit toward rows of warbikes whose tanks were being filled faster than the Imperial crews had ever managed. The Orcs did not occupy conquered ground. They digested it. Ghazghkull walked through the middle of that feeding army, while mechs repaired him without asking permission for either task. His mega armor still carried the damage inflicted at Gallows. One breastplate was warped inward where plasma had struck. A thick cable ran externally from his shoulder assembly to the mechanism controlling Gork's claw because the original feed had been severed. Several armor plates did not match those around them, replacement slabs cut from Imperial vehicles and hammered into shape while the Prophet remained inside the suit. A mech stood on a platform rolling beside him, welding along the edge of one shoulder while Gaz walked. Sparks cascaded over Makari. "Keep still, boss," the mech shouted. Ghazghkull did not slow. "Work faster." The mech swore and increased the current. Makari ducked beneath another spray of sparks and decided that if the Prophet wanted to be repaired while marching toward the next war council, then reality would have to make room for it. Around them, the captured district reproduced war faster than the Imperium could count its losses. Gretchen crawled through wreckage looking for ammunition whose caliber they did not understand. If a shell did not fit an Orc weapon, a mech modified the weapon until it did. Damaged battle wagons received Imperial track assemblies. Hydraulics stripped from cargo lifters became joints in stomper legs. Vox units were opened, insulted, hammered and rebuilt into crude receivers. A ruined Hydra emplacement had become a nest of Orc guns, its original targeting apparatus discarded because the new crew considered aiming unnecessary. Boys dragged corpses from roadways only when the bodies obstructed vehicles. Scrap piles rose beside crude workshops erected in the shells of Manufactoria. Glyphs appeared on walls. Squig pens filled loading bays. Grots established markets where ammunition, knives, teeth, fungus beer, and stolen Imperial insignia changed hands.
What had been a human supply center at dawn had become an orc war town before night. Makari had seen worlds conquered by orcs before. Most war bosses thought conquest meant owning something. Ghazghkull thought differently. The Prophet stopped beside a captured Steel Legion tank whose hull had been opened along one side. A mech was explaining to a cluster of knobs how the vehicle could be fitted with larger exhausts, a faster engine, and enough forward guns to make turning unnecessary. Ghazghkull ignored the explanation and looked beyond the tank toward Deathmire. The Hive glowed against the poisoned horizon. Artillery flashes pulsed around its outer districts. Even after Gallows fell, even after Mannheim bled, even after Tempestor Victorum shook beneath millions of orcs, the humans were still fighting. "Good," Gaz said. Makari looked up at him. "Good?" The Prophet pointed toward the Hive. "Still got more. More humies? More fight." Makari considered that. Thought we was taken to place. Gaz looked down at him. Makari immediately added, "Not saying we ain't, just wondering." Ghazghkull turned his gaze back toward the distant lights. "Take a world. World's gone. Burn it all. Fight's done." Makari's ears twitched. "Armageddon fights," Gaz continued. "So more humies come. Angels come. Big walkers come. Old Baali comes. They come 'cause displace matters. And day boys come 'cause their humies come." "Yeah." Makari smiled slowly. That was the thing about Ghazghkull that many orcs did not understand until it was too late. They saw the battles. They saw him crush tanks, kill rival bosses, and stand beneath enough gunfire to murder whole mobs. They heard him roar the name of Gork and Mork, and believed the important thing was that he was bigger, meaner, and harder than anything else alive. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. Gaz looked at war the way mechs looked at machines. He saw where power came from. Armageddon made power. Every Imperial regiment sent to defend it gave orcs another enemy worth crossing the stars to fight. Every Space Marine chapter that carved Armageddon campaign marks into its armor made the world more sacred to greenskins who had heard the stories of the old wars. Every Titan that walked its plains promised Gargant crews an enemy large enough to matter. Every fortress that survived became an insult. Every orc who survived and returned to another warband carried tales of the world where the fighting never ended. The Wa did not merely consume war. War fed it. Ghazghkull intended to keep feeding it. A group of prisoners was being marched across an adjoining loading yard when the Prophet saw them. Several hundred Imperial laborers and guardsmen moved under the guns of orc guards. Many were wounded. Some carried comrades because the orcs had ordered the column kept moving and had shot anyone who collapsed. Near the far end of the yard, a war boss named Graka Ironjaw had arranged captured officers against a wall. His boys were taking turns shooting them. The bodies had begun piling beneath a row of Imperial aquilae already defaced with green glyphs. Graka saw Ghazghkull approaching and grinned. "Boss, look what we got." Gaz stopped. A wounded Steel Legion captain stood against the wall with blood soaking one side of his greatcoat. Graka raised a slugger toward the man's face. Ghazghkull said, "Why?" Graka lowered the weapon slightly. "Why what? Why you killing them?" Graka laughed, certain he had been asked something simple. "'Cause they're humies." Several knobs around him joined the laughter. Gaz did not. Graka's grin faded. "They got mates?" Gaz asked. "Course." "They know they're here?" Graka scratched one side of his jaw. "Dunno." "Find out." The war boss frowned. "Could just kill him." Ghazghkull moved closer. Graka made the mistake of continuing. "Plenty more humies." Gork's claw struck him in the chest. The power field flared. Armor buckled. Graka flew backward into the wall he had been using for executions and hit hard enough to crack the ferrocrete behind him. Before he fell, Gaz caught him by the throat with the claw and lifted him. Graka kicked. "Boss!" Ghazghkull slammed him into the wall again. Something broke inside the war boss. Blood spilled between his tusks. "Humies come get their mates," Gaz said. "They bring guns, tanks, angels." Graka tried to answer. The claw tightened enough to collapse his windpipe. "You was throwing fighting away." Gaz closed the claw. Graka's head remained above the pincers for a fraction of a second, while his torso compressed beneath them. Ribs punched through torn armor. His abdomen burst. Blood and viscera spilled across Ghazghkull's gauntlet and slapped onto the ground below. The claw closed farther until spine and armor cracked together, then opened. What remained dropped beneath the bodies of the Imperial officers Graka had killed. Gaz pointed at the prisoners. "Send word. Tell the Humies we got 'em." A Nob stared at him. "Then kill 'em?" Ghazghkull looked toward Deathmire. "If they come." The Nob grinned. Makari understood. Mercy had nothing to do with it. Gaz would have killed every prisoner in the district himself if their deaths drew the larger battle closer. He would have ordered 1,000,000 captives butchered if the blood made the Wa stronger. But killing them for amusement when they could be turned into a weapon was waste. Ghazghkull hated waste almost as much as cowardice. Word spread among the orcs before the prophet reached the next district. Makari heard it changing as it traveled. Gaz had spared the Humies because Gork told him to. No, Mork had told him. No, Gaz had heard both of them arguing and chosen the better idea. No, the prisoners were a sacrifice for later. No, Gaz was waiting until old Baali came personally to collect them. By the time Makari crossed the next workshop yard, one Nob was telling a mob that Ghazghkull had looked into the sky and seen the whole future burning green. Nobody questioned the story. That was another kind of weapon. Makari had carried the prophet's banner through enough wars to recognize the look in other orcs now. War bosses who once spoke Ghazghkull's name with calculation now spoke it with caution. Boys stopped fighting one another when he approached. Weird boys became agitated before he entered a room. Some orcs believed Gaz spoke directly to Gork and Mork. Others whispered that he would one day become something greater than a war boss, greater even than the old legends of the beast. Gaz never corrected them. He did not need to. Every victory made belief easier. Every impossible survival made the next impossible thing seem inevitable. And inevitability made orcs fight harder. A boy charging beneath Ghazghkull's glyph would keep running after losing an arm because the prophet could not lose. A warbiker would drive faster because Gaz was watching. A war boss would commit another 1,000 boys because refusing would make him look afraid. Belief moved armies before orders reached them. On the Fist of Macragga, Marneus Calgar reached the same conclusion without ever hearing an orc tell the story. The hololithic Armageddon rotated before him while Yarrick's image stood above a secondary projector. Operation Imperator's officers had spent hours comparing the fighting at Mannheim, Deathmire, Gallows, and the Equatorial Jungle. Individually, the engagements appeared contradictory. Ghazghkull seized ground and then failed to exploit it. He bypassed isolated Imperial formations, only to attack stronger ones. He sacrificed mobs against fortified lines without securing immediate objectives. He allowed retreating Imperial forces to survive where pursuit might have destroyed them. Together, the contradictions vanished. "He is preserving resistance," Calgar said. Yarrick's image flickered beneath transmission interference. "Yes." An Ultramarines captain studied the map. "That suggests strategic irrationality. Every surviving Imperial formation remains a threat." "To us," Yarrick said. The captain looked toward him. "Not to Ghazghkull." Calgar enlarged the routes around Deathmire. "His definition of victory is not ours. Territory matters only when it produces further battle. Destroyed enemy formations cannot reinforce. Surviving formations demand replacements, ammunition, relief forces." "Which we provide," said another officer. "And every arrival strengthens the narrative that Armageddon is the greatest war in the sector," Calgar replied. Yarrick said nothing. Calgar looked at him. There is more. The Commissar's expression remained severe. You believe this concerns you. Yarrick's natural eye shifted toward the hololith. Ghazghkull had opportunities to kill me before now. Nobody in the chamber spoke. On Icaria, Yarrick continued, he could have ensured it. He did not. One of the officers said, "Why preserve an enemy who has opposed him for decades?" Yarrick's voice became quieter. "Because I make Armageddon fight harder." The words disturbed the chamber more than any boast could have. Ghazghkull did not hate Yarrick in the human sense. Hatred wanted the object destroyed. Gaz had done something more dangerous. He had incorporated Yarrick into the story of himself. Old Baal I was the human who resisted. The human orcs knew. The human whose presence meant the fight mattered. Yarrick alive drew Imperial courage into the war. Imperial. Courage drew armies. Armies drew orcs. Ghazghkull had turned his greatest enemy into part of the war. Calgar closed several tactical windows. Then Operation Imperator changes. The officers looked toward him. We stop measuring ground. Fresh attack vectors appeared. We stop answering every challenge. More runes formed around the orc concentration outside Deathmire. We break momentum. A coordinated counterstroke began taking shape across the hololith. Astartes' strike forces would hit the orc concentration only after Navy fire isolated the approach corridors. Steel Legion armor would attack secondary routes instead of advancing toward the Prophet directly. Thunderhawks would maintain mobile reserves rather than committing them in the opening assault. Black Templars would receive hard targets worth their aggression. Space Wolves would be released against exposed orc flanks once the counterattack began. Salamanders would hold the evacuation arteries and prevent orc breakthroughs from becoming massacres capable of creating fresh momentum. Calgar looked at the growing pattern. Ghazghkull wanted a battle. He would have one, but not on his terms. The intelligence reached the orcs before Imperial command expected. A captured Vox set screamed inside Ghazghkull's war council while a mech hit it with a spanner until the interference cleared. War bosses filled the chamber around the Prophet, each surrounded by knobs and glyph bearers. Wazdaka leaned beside Big Reva's fuel assembly, impatient to leave. Snickrot was not visible, which did not necessarily mean he was absent. The mech listened. His grin widened. "Boss, blue Humies." Ghazghkull looked over. "Big lot." "Which one?" "Da important one." The mech jabbed at a distorted Imperial transmission. "Calgar." Ghazghkull went still. Then his mouth opened into an enormous grin. Makari saw the same expression that had appeared when the Prophet learned Yarrick lived. Not rage, joy. "Calgar," Gaz repeated. The war bosses began muttering. Gaz lifted one hand. Silence fell. "Angels are coming." Boys outside the chamber heard the words and began roaring. One war boss stepped forward. "We hold the walls?" Gaz looked at him as though the question was strange. "No." "Fortified a spaceport?" "No." "Pulled the wagons in?" Ghazghkull laughed. The war bosses stared. "Let 'em come." He pointed toward the approaches to Deathmire. "Let 'em get close." His grin widened. "Let 'em think they got us." The Prophet turned toward the gathered bosses, and the wah beyond the chamber seemed to swell with him. "Den when every angel's in the fight." Gork's claw closed with a hydraulic crack. "We charge." Operation Imperator began with the sky opening in fire. Orbital batteries struck first, lance lights spearing down through Armageddon's poisoned atmosphere in columns so bright they cast black shadows across the ash wastes. A heartbeat later, artillery batteries hidden dozens of kilometers behind the Imperial lines fired according to prearranged schedules, Earthshaker shells and Manticore rockets descending upon Orc staging grounds already burning beneath the orbital strikes. The bombardment did not wander. It moved in deliberate belts, each impact zone timed to end seconds before the first Space Marine assault craft crossed it. Thunderhawks came through the clouds under curtains of tracer fire, their armor glowing where atmospheric friction and flak had scorched the hulls. Drop pods followed like shells fired by the void itself. Some were struck before deployment and came apart in the upper atmosphere, ceramite fragments and dead warriors scattering across kilometers of battlefield. Most survived. They struck among the greenskin concentrations with enough force to crater Ferrocrete, assault ramps blasting outward before the dust had settled. Ultramarines emerged firing. Black Templars came down chanting praises to the God Emperor. Space wolves hit farther east, howling challenges through open vox as they drove toward the first visible weakness. Salamanders descended close to the evacuation corridors, where Orc armor had been threatening the columns, still feeding civilians and wounded soldiers away from Deathmire. The operation did not begin as one charge. It began as 100 blades entering the same body. Brother Sergeant Castor Venn came down. Inside the Western Industrial Quarter, aboard a Thunderhawk, whose starboard engine had been hit twice during approach. The gunship remained airborne only long enough for his squad to disembark before banking away under heavy fire. Venn landed beside the wreck of a Chimera, brought his bolt rifle to bear, and killed the first Orc he saw with 2 rounds through the chest. Axis Primus secure, squad advance by sections, maintain lateral contact with the Templars. His helm display showed the wider assault unfolding around him. Ultramarines were moving in mutually supporting spearheads, each one tied to the others by fire corridors and prearranged reserve positions. They did not seek the loudest enemy. They sought the positions whose destruction weakened everything around them. To Venn's left, Black Templars smashed into a fortified Orc scrapyard beneath shouted litanies of hate, chainswords screaming as they entered close combat before the smoke from the bombardment had cleared. To his right, space wolves broke through a gap opened by Navy bombers and immediately widened it, assault squads racing along the exposed flank of an Orc armored column like predators seeing blood. Farther south, Salamanders stood across a transit route where refugee transports were still crawling toward the Hive, melter weapons waiting until battle wagons closed to ranges where even crude armor could not save them. The Orcs died in numbers that would have ended most wars. Entire mobs vanished beneath overlapping artillery and bolter fire. One Stomper attempted to cross an open Manufactorum square and received 3 Lascannon strikes in less than a second, followed by a melter blast that tore open its lower hull and set the interior ablaze. Burning boys poured from access hatches and were cut down before they reached cover. Battle wagons advancing nose to tail along a refinery road became a chain of explosions when the lead vehicle was immobilized, and those behind continued driving into the wreck. Black Templars entered the resulting pileup and butchered the crews at close range, black armor disappearing beneath sprays of green blood. A space wolf with a frost-edged blade hacked through an Orc's shoulder, split ribs and lung, then used the dying body as cover against a burst of shooter fire before driving forward again. Salamanders fired flamers into a service tunnel packed with boys and turned the entire passage into an enclosed furnace. Orcs emerged from the far end, burning from head to foot, skin splitting, eyes opaque, still trying to charge until disciplined bolter volleys tore them apart. Behind the Astartes came Major Ren Varric and the surviving armor of the Steel Legion. His formation did not receive songs or crusade prayers. It received road assignments. Chimeras moved into districts the Space Marines had passed through and killed the mobs that had been bypassed rather than destroyed. Lehman Russ tanks parked across junctions and fired into side streets to prevent Orc reinforcements from closing the routes behind the assault. Munitorum ammunition carriers followed under escort. Recovery vehicles dragged damaged transports away before they could block the roads. Fuel bowsers moved from one temporary depot to another, each one a target more strategically valuable than dozens of infantry squads. Varric knew the entire offensive would fail if the Angels of Death ran out of ammunition faster than it could be brought forward. Second troop, secure the western loading artery. Third troop stays with the carriers. Rust section, do not chase armor beyond the marked line. Any orc trying to cross behind the Marines dies here. A gunner inside the command chimera laughed without humor. Glorious work, sir. Varric watched a servitor lose half its body to a stray shell and continue dragging ammunition crates until its remaining tracks seized. Glory is for men with time to write about it. For several hours the Imperium drove deeper than it had since Ghazghkull's return. The first orc defensive belt collapsed. The second never properly formed. Ultramarines destroyed teleporter beacons before the mechs operating them could activate. Navy aircraft hit fuel compounds. Space Wolves overran a gun line whose crews had been turning their weapons toward the main advance. Black Templars seized a fortified transit hub and held it long enough for Steel Legion armor to pass through before abandoning the ruin and advancing again. The map, aboard Calgar's command vessel, showed Imperial markers cutting into the greenskin concentration from multiple directions. For the first time, Operation Imperator was not merely slowing the War, it was opening it. That was when the first teleporter flare appeared behind the Ultramarines. Green light erupted beside an Imperial ammunition point without warning. Reality folded inward. A squad of meganobs materialized inside the perimeter, some embedded partially in debris, others arriving cleanly enough to begin killing at once. One drove a power claw through a Steel Legion officer and lifted him from the ground, crushing ribcage and spine before throwing the body into an ammunition stack. Another opened fire into the fuel crews. The attack lasted less than a minute before reserve Astartes killed the meganobs, but by then, the depot was burning. Then speed freaks hit the roads. Warbikers appeared along logistics routes that had been screened clear only minutes earlier. Buggies raced between armor columns, firing into recovery vehicles and fuel carriers instead of challenging battle tanks. One bike rammed a Munitorum truck, carrying bolt ammunition, and vanished with the vehicle in a detonation that threw burning magazines across half a street. Commandos struck command relays almost simultaneously. Vox towers went silent. Navigation markers disappeared. Captured Imperial signals began transmitting false route corrections. Orc mobs that had seemed scattered inside ruined districts emerged from concealed assembly points and attacked the flanks of the Imperial spearheads. Calgar saw the trap before most commanders knew there was one. The Orcs had not constructed a neat defensive line because Ghazghkull had never intended to defend. He had left spaces. Operation Imperator had entered them. Reserve elements forward, Calgar ordered. All spearheads terminate advance at current objectives. Logistics priority. No formation pursues withdrawing greenskins. Repeat, no pursuit. The orders reached Venn as his force entered a Manufacturum district mapped as nearly cleared. A rocket struck the repulsor ahead of him. The vehicle lurched, lost thrust on one side, and crashed into a ferrocrete support. Orcs came from every direction. Perimeter, Venn shouted. His squad formed around the crippled armor, while two other Ultramarines units fell back toward them. A Black Templars squad appeared from the southern street, carrying 3 wounded brothers.
Space Wolves were visible on an elevated roadway to the north, fighting their way toward an extraction route already cut by warbikes. The battle contracted. Astartes became a circle of ceramite amid green bodies. Bolters fired until barrels steamed. Every shot mattered. Mass reactive rounds tore orcs apart at ranges too short for misses. Venn killed one boy through the mouth and blew the back of its skull across the warrior behind it. He fired into the second orc's chest, shifted left, and cut down a knob charging through the wreckage. Brother Pelion reached an empty magazine, dropped it, and found only one replacement remaining. Ammunition stayed low. Controlled fire. Already controlled. Then control it better. A plasma weapon discharged nearby, the shot vaporizing an orc and leaving scorched fragments of its armor embedded in a wall. Warning runes flashed over the weapon's housing. The battle brother carrying it waited for the coils to cool
and was struck by a chopper before he could fire again. The blade gouged across his pauldron. He caught the orc by the throat and slammed it into the ground hard enough to break its spine. Chainswords began replacing bolt rifles. Ven drew his power sword when the orcs reached the perimeter. The blade activated with a hard electrical growl. He cut through the first boy's forearm and neck in the same motion. The next hit him in the breastplate with a chopper and left a deep gouge across the ceramite. Ven drove his sword through the orc's abdomen, twisted and ripped upward. Entrails spilled across his gauntlet. Another orc stepped on them while charging. The floor became slick with blood, fuel, hydraulic fluid, and fragments of bodies. Chainsword teeth choked on muscle and scraps of armor. Warriors cleared the mechanisms with armored hands and went back to killing. The orcs were dying. The orcs were winning the distance. Then Mork's roar spoke. The weapon's fire entered the perimeter from the western avenue like a moving wall. A Black Templar disappeared behind the first impacts. His armor burst at the waist and shoulder. The next burst tore through the damaged repulsor, smashing weapon housings and blowing an ultramarine from the upper hull. Ferrocrete walls behind them disintegrated into dust and shrapnel. Ven threw himself behind the wreck as fire crossed the position. The boys began roaring. Ven knew who was coming. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka walked through his own advancing mobs, while Mork's roar fired ahead of him. His mega armor was already damaged. One shoulder carried replacement plating scorched black by Imperial weapons. Cables hung from beneath the breastplate. Blood streaked one side of his face. None of it made him look weakened. It made him look like something that had already been subjected to every reasonable method of killing and had judged them insufficient. "Prophet confirmed," Ven voxed. "Concentrate fire!" Every surviving heavy weapon fired at once. A Lascanon beam struck Ghazghkull's chest and blew armor fragments from him. Plasma followed, burning into the wound. Bolter rounds hammered his shoulders, neck and weapons. A gravitic projectile struck one leg and forced him sideways. Mork's roar stopped. The Astartes kept firing. A second Lascanon hit. Ghazghkull fell to one knee. Again. Plasma struck his left arm. Again. The orc lifted his head. Then he charged. He crossed the ground faster than anything in that much armor should have moved. Boys around him died under the same fire intended for their profit. Ghazghkull used their bodies as nothing more than moving interference. Gork's claw closed around a Black Templar before the warrior could bring his power sword to bear. Ceramite cracked. The claw tightened, and the Templar's torso collapsed inward, blood bursting from the neck seal in a red jet. Gaz hurled the broken body into another Space Marine and kept moving. An Ultramarine struck him with a thunder hammer. The impact dented Ghazghkull's breastplate and forced him back. The Marine swung again. Gaz caught the weapon arm with the claw. The pincers closed above the elbow. Armor, bone, and muscle sheared together. The severed arm remained attached to the hammer as it fell. The Ultramarine did not scream. He attacked with his remaining hand. Gaz headbutted him. The Marine's helmet cracked. Gaz struck again. The second impact drove broken ceramite inward through the warrior's face. Ven reached the Prophet from the flank. His power sword entered beneath a damaged armor plate at Ghazghkull's ribs. The blade bit deep. Gaz roared. For an instant, Ven felt resistance lessen as the weapon cut through armor, dense flesh, and whatever crude machinery had been installed beneath. Then the Prophet turned. Gork's claw closed around Ven. He had time to wrench the sword free before the pincers caught his torso. Pressure came first, then pain. Ceramite compressed around his ribs. Warning runes filled his helm. His armor's internal systems screamed structural failure. He drove the sword into Gaz's forearm and cut through cables. The claw tightened. Something broke inside Ven. He heard it, rather than felt it. A Black Templar attacked Gaz from the right, power axe striking the damaged claw housing. An Ultramarine fired a plasma pistol into the same joint. Another brother rammed his chainsword into the exposed hydraulic assembly. The claw opened. Ven fell. Brother Pillion caught him before he hit the ground. "Move," Ven rasped.
Pelion dragged him backward while the remaining Astartes closed around them. "Leave me." "No. Operational priority is preserving combat strength." Pelion fired his last bolt rounds into a charging knob. The Astartes around Ven knew what they were doing. They were buying seconds. A Black Templar stepped into Ghazghkull's path beneath a shouted oath to the God Emperor and buried his blade in the Prophet's shoulder. Gaz killed him with Mork's roar at a distance so close, the weapon's muzzle blast tore the corpse apart. 2 Ultramarines fired plasma until one weapon overheated and burst, burning its wielder's gauntlet to the bone. A Space Wolf reached the perimeter from the north and struck Gaz with a power axe before being hurled through a ferrocrete wall. Pelion carried Ven toward the withdrawal lane.
Behind them, the warriors who remained did not retreat. They died in order, one firing, one covering, one holding Ghazghkull for another heartbeat. Ven understood the price with perfect clarity. That clarity hurt more than the broken ribs. Calgar's withdrawal order arrived before the trap could close completely. Thunderhawks redirected toward isolated spearheads. Steel Legion columns reversed through roads Varric had kept open. Basilisks laid denial barrages across pursuing orcs. Demolition charges collapsed transitways after the final vehicles passed. Salamanders held evacuation corridors until mortal formations cleared, then withdrew beneath flame and melter fire. Black Templars yielded captured ground only when ordered directly by their marshal. Space Wolves abandoned their deepest penetration after destroying the war boss commanding the sector, carrying wounded brothers with them rather than allowing the orcs trophies. Operation Imperator did not become a rout. That was Calgar's victory. The Imperium retained several transport nexuses. Orc staging grounds remained destroyed. Thousands of greenskin vehicles burned. Entire mobs had been annihilated. Ghazghkull's center had been wounded badly enough that the Wa would require time to reform. But it had not broken. Night came over a battlefield layered in bodies. Orcs lay in drifts against wrecked vehicles. Astartes' corpses remained among them, where recovery had been impossible. Burning armor illuminated the dead in red and orange. Ghazghkull stood in the center of it all, while mechs crawled across his damaged warplate. Hydraulic fluid leaked from Gork's claw. Mork's roar hung crooked from a shattered mounting. Blood ran beneath Gaz's armor and steamed where it touched hot metal. Makari approached cautiously. He expected anger. Ghazghkull was grinning. The Prophet looked across the dead angels of death, the burning tanks, the ruined streets, and the broken orcs, who were already dragging themselves upright to continue fighting. He began to laugh. Not because the Imperium had failed, because it had nearly succeeded, because the angels had hurt him, because they had killed enough boys to make the Wa. Remember the day. Because somewhere beyond the smoke, Calgar was still alive, Yarrick was still alive, and the greatest war on Armageddon was becoming greater. Ghazghkull raised Gork's claw. The damaged weapon closed with a hydraulic shriek. "Wah!" The answer came from every surviving orc who could still draw breath. It rolled across the battlefield like thunder. Hive Death Mire had ceased to resemble a city and had become a wound large enough to contain armies. Fires burned through habstacks without anyone remaining to fight them. Promethium leaked from ruptured mains and ran along gutters in burning streams. The lower floors of Manufactoria had been abandoned to the dead because there were too many bodies to move, and too few living men who could be spared to move them. Guardsmen fought from upper levels, while stairwells below filled with corpses stacked waist-deep around barricades. Orcs crossed avenues whose original surfaces had disappeared beneath rubble, wrecked vehicles, and the bodies of earlier mobs. Some streets had been fought over so often that every doorway held a dead man, a dead orc, or both. Artillery continued falling, even where command no longer knew which side controlled the ground. Shells collapsed hab blocks onto battles still being fought inside them. Entire platoons vanished beneath tons of ferrocrete. Orc mobs dug through the debris from one side, while Imperial survivors dug from the other. and when the two groups met in the darkness, they killed one another with bayonets, choppers, entrenching tools and bare hands, because ammunition had become too valuable to waste where a blade would serve. The Hive heart lay deeper within Deathmire, beyond the outer manufactoria and fortified transit belts. It was not a single chamber or ceremonial center. It was the administrative and mechanical knot that allowed the Hive to function as a fortress. Power regulation stations fed defense grids. Cogitator vaults distributed command traffic. Transit nexuses routed armor, ammunition, and men between sectors. Munitorum stores supplied firing lines that would otherwise empty within hours. Vox relays connected artillery commands to observers scattered across the city. To lose the heart did not mean Deathmire
ceased to exist. It meant Deathmire would begin fighting itself, each isolated district forced to survive on whatever ammunition, fuel, and orders remained locally available. Ghazghkull understood that. He had understood roads, fuel, and supply corridors. Before many Imperial commanders had accepted, he understood anything beyond charging the nearest gun. The Orcs came for the heart, along every route still open. Major Ren Varric's command Chimera died in a tunnel called Ferrum Passage. It had survived the western wastes, Mannheim, Tempestor, Victorum, and Gallows, only to lose its final track beneath a ceiling already black with smoke. A rocket struck the rear quarter, tore through the engine housing, and filled the compartment with burning oil. Varric kicked the emergency release when the main hatch failed. Men climbed out coughing through rebreathers, while flames spread behind them. The driver remained inside. Nobody went back for him. The heat made that impossible within seconds. Two other chimeras died farther ahead, one immobilized by debris, and the other split open by a crude Orc shell fired down the passage. The surviving crews dismounted. Steel Legion infantry had been trained to fight from armored carriers, to use mobility as armor and distance as survival. Now they stood inside a tunnel, barely wide enough for their wrecked transports with laser guns, grenades, and whatever weapons could be stripped from the dead. The loss felt more personal than Varric expected. A Steel Legionnaire without a chimera was not merely a soldier on foot. He was a doctrine with its legs cut from beneath it. "Strip the heavy bolter," Varric ordered. Sergeant Cord looked at the burning transport. "Mounts fused." "Then cut it out." "We've got no power cutter." Varric pointed toward a dead Orc lying beside a smashed maintenance cart. "Use his axe." Cord looked at the chopper, then at Varric. "Understood." 5 minutes later, two men carried the heavy bolter between them, while another dragged ammunition belts across the floor. They met the next Orc assault at a junction filled with smoke. Boys poured from a service corridor in a mass too dense for aiming to matter. Varric's men fired by ranks. Las bolts punched into green bodies and filled the passage with flashes of red light. The salvaged heavy bolter opened from the center and began tearing Orcs apart. One mass-reactive round entered a boy's chest and exploded behind the ribs, throwing both arms outward as the torso opened. Another struck ahead and removed everything above the lower jaw. The dead fell, and the living climbed over them. A knob reached the barricade with 3 lance wounds, smoking through his abdomen, and buried a chopper in a guardsman's shoulder. The blade continued through clavicle and ribs until the man dropped beneath it. Cord fired a las burst into the knob's face and kicked the corpse back into the mob. "Grenades!" Varric shouted. Frag grenades bounced among boots, disappeared beneath bodies, and detonated. Flesh, bone, and armor fragments filled the corridor. The Orcs recoiled just long enough for the Steel Legion to move to the next defensive position. They were not retreating. They were trading corridors for minutes. Elsewhere, Ghazghkull was making minutes worthless. Big Reva screamed through one of Deathmire's primary cargo arteries at a speed never intended inside enclosed infrastructure. The tunnel had been built for freight haulers, tank columns, and ore carriers, not war bikes. Ghazghkull treated that as a challenge rather than a limitation.
He drove between wrecked chimeras, over shattered barricades, and along loading ramps, while the Psycho Gatler fired ahead of him. Imperial defenders heard the engine long before they saw the bike. By the time heavy weapons traversed, Ghazghkull was already beneath their firing arcs. One autocannon crew managed a single burst before the Psycho Gatler tore through the firing step. The gunner lost both arms. The loader's chest disappeared in a spray of blood and armor fragments. Ghazghkull hit the barricade itself an instant later, Big Rever launching from the wreck of a cargo hauler and landing behind the position. "Too slow," he bellowed. Warbikers followed through the gap. The purpose of the attack was not to hold the tunnel. Ghazghkull had no interest in standing anywhere long enough for artillery coordinates to catch him. He broke the barricade, killed the defenders, and kept moving. Trucks followed, unloading boys into adjoining service levels. The orcs flooded sideways into stairwells and maintenance corridors, while the bikes tore deeper into the Hive. Ghazghkull's speed was opening arteries for slower violence. At the cloisters, Brother Sergeant Castor Venn learned that victory could become meaningless through repetition. His ultramarines had killed hundreds of orcs since dawn. The corridor before him remained full. "Controlled pairs," he ordered. Bolters fired. The first rank of boys exploded. The second rank stepped through them. A Black Templar fighting beside Venn emptied his magazine, drew his chainsword, and went forward beneath a roar of, "No pity, no remorse, no fear." The blade entered an orc's chest and tore upward through sternum and throat. The Templar pivoted, severed another boy's arm at the elbow, and drove the chainsword through its skull. Venn's own squad maintained a tighter line, firing until the orcs reached charge distance, and then advancing only far enough to restore space. Farther down the cloisters, salamanders used flamers in the narrow approaches. Promethium turned corridors into furnaces. Orcs burned by the dozen. The stench of cooked flesh entered even sealed Astartes armor through external chemical sensors. They killed 300. An hour later, 500 came. They killed those as well. Then more arrived. Astartes' casualties were smaller, but mathematically more important. One space marine lost could not be replaced before the next assault. One orc mob lost could apparently be replaced before the blood of the previous mob cooled. Venn had known this intellectually. Deathmire made it physical. Empty ammunition racks, missing warriors in formation, wounded brothers fighting because there were no reserves left to take their place. Ghazghkull came through the inner manufactoria behind a wall of his own dead. Meganobs had opened the route first and paid for every meter. Their bodies lay among wrecked tanks and shattered gun emplacements, armor split by lascannons and plasma fire. Gaz walked past them with Mork's roar firing in bursts, short enough to conserve ammunition and long enough to erase resistance. A firing gallery disappeared beneath the weapons storm. Ferrocrete chipped away until men behind it were exposed. The next burst tore them apart. One guardsman fell from the gallery, missing everything below the ribs. Another hung from twisted railing with one leg severed at the thigh. Gaz moved beneath them without looking upward. A sentinel stepped from a side passage and fired its autocannon into him at almost touching distance. The first round struck his breastplate. The second burst tore away a replacement armor section. Gaz turned. Gork's claw closed around the walker's leg. He pulled. The sentinel toppled sideways. The pilot fired until the gun struck the floor and jammed. Gaz ripped the cockpit housing open and reached inside. The pilot disappeared in the claw. Blood spilled down the machine's side. He kept walking. Around him, the industrial war continued without reference to any individual act of violence. Basilisk shells fell several districts away. Orc gun batteries answered. Mechs dragged damaged battle wagons toward improvised repair stations, while fresh mobs pushed past them. Gretchen carried ammunition through corridors lined with burning bodies. Gaz could tear apart a war machine with his hands and still remain only 1 point inside a battle consuming millions. A Vox operator ran toward him. "Boss, hear me talk." Gaz looked down. "Bail eyes close." The boys around him reacted immediately. "Baelai! Old Baelai! Find him!" The chant began to spread. Gaz raised one hand. The orcs quieted. "Where?" The operator pointed deeper into the hive. "Command place. Few districts." A knob stepped forward. "We go get him?" Gaz looked toward the next transport nexus. "No." The knob stared. "Boss? Heart first." "But Baelai..." Gaz turned his head. The knob stopped talking. "Baelai ain't running," Gaz said. "Humies need this place. Break it, they come." Makari looked up at him and grinned. Even now, with the one enemy Gaz valued above almost every other within reach, the Prophet refused to throw away the larger battle for a personal hunt. Several districts east, Yarrick received the same information from the opposite direction. "Confirmed sighting of Thraka in Manufactorum Sector Kappa," an officer reported. "Estimated distance to command nexus, less than 4 kilometers." Another officer turned toward Yarrick. "Commissar, we can relocate you." "No." "Sir, if Ghazghkull is that close..." "I heard you." The officer stopped. Yarrick stood before the tactical display, while red markers crawled toward the heart. His body hurt with every breath. One augmetic joint had locked twice in the last hour. Blood had soaked through the dressing beneath his coat. None of it mattered. "Reinforce Transit Nexus Primus," he ordered. "Withdraw artillery coordinators from the southern archive before the orcs cut the route. Leave demolitions." "Commissar, your evacuation is not the objective." The officer swallowed. "Yes, sir." The hive heart began falling shortly afterward. The first command bunker was breached from below when commandos detonated charges in a maintenance level beneath it. The floor collapsed. Orcs came through the dust before survivors could form a new line. Las fire flashed in darkness. Choppers struck against armor and bone. A command adept died with one hand still holding a Varric, reached the central administrative concourse with fewer than half the men who had left Ferrum Passage. They fought without vehicles. He hated it. The concourse filled with orcs anyway. Bayonets. Steel Legion bayonets locked beneath laser gun barrels. The order felt ancient. The fighting became older still. Men stabbed at throats and eyes. Orcs hacked through greatcoats and flak armor. A guardsman drove his bayonet into an orc's abdomen, lost the rifle when the creature grabbed it, drew a trench knife, and continued stabbing until a chopper split his skull. Varric shot one boy through the face at arm's length, fired into another's chest, and struck a third with the butt of his laser gun when the weapon cycled empty. Cord killed a knob using a scavenged orc axe and lost 2 fingers when the blade caught beneath a power claw. Then the withdrawal signal came. Nobody cheered. They moved. The surviving Imperial formations did not die theatrically around the heart. They fell back by routes prepared in advance. Demolition charges brought down passages after the last squads crossed. Astartes covered junctions while wounded brothers were evacuated. Steel Legion infantry retreated through Manufactorum levels towards secondary defensive districts. Artillery observers abandoned consoles and carried targeting data with them. Command personnel destroyed cogitator cores they could not move. The orcs took the heart through blood. Thousands died inside its approaches. Thousands more entered behind them. By the time Ghazghkull reached the central command vaults, the floors were hidden beneath bodies. Boys climbed over boys. Imperial dead lay among them. Burned armor stuck to ferrocrete. Blood ran into drainage channels already blocked with severed limbs. The Prophet stood inside the captured nexus, while orcs howled around him. Gallows remained theirs. The heart was theirs. Deathmire was not. Imperial positions still held eastern districts, sections of the cloisters, and several defensive belts beyond the center. Artillery still fired. Space Marines still fought. Steel Legion armor remained active around the outer approaches. The Hive had been cut apart, not conquered whole. For anyone else, the result might have been called indecisive. For Armageddon, it was normal. Night settled beyond the Hive's smoke. Yarrick reached a secondary command post and received the strategic assessment. An aide handed him a casualty slate. He read. The list scrolled. Regiments reduced below operational strength. Tank companies destroyed. Artillery batteries lost. Astartes casualties. Navis Imperialis losses. Munitorum personnel. Hive defense units. The numbers continued for minutes. Yarrick set the slate down. Status of Deathmire? Heart lost. Gallows remains in greenskin control. Eastern defensive sectors holding. Several western districts contested. We retain enough strength to prevent complete seizure of the Hive. Yarrick looked at the hololith. Deathmire was a patchwork of imperial blue, orc red, and contested amber. Not saved, not fallen. Another Armageddon battlefield. Then the augur officer went pale. Commissar. Yarrick turned. New contacts. How many? The officer stared at the incoming returns. I don't know. Fresh runes appeared above the planetary projection. Then more. Then dozens. Warp translation signatures and crude greenskin vessels multiplied across the outer system, drawn toward Armageddon by stories, signals, and the psychic roar of a wah, now powerful enough to cross the void before the fleets themselves arrived. Yarrick watched the contacts increase. Ghazghkull had not merely brought an army to Armageddon. He had made Armageddon call more orcs to itself. The guns did not stop when the Hive heart fell. They changed targets. That was all. Artillery continued beyond the burning western districts of Deathmire, Earthshaker shells passing overhead in long, screaming arcs, while orc guns answered from positions established inside buildings the Imperium had occupied only the day before. The Hive burned without pause. Smoke climbed from habstacks, manufactoria, transit stations, and ruptured promethium reservoirs until the poisoned sky above Deathmire became a second ceiling, black and red, and endlessly illuminated by distant detonations. Recovery crews moved through the streets beneath sniper fire, towing crippled chimeras from intersections, while Steel Legion infantry searched rubble for wounded men. Some found survivors, most found bodies. Commando shots cracked from ruined upper floors whenever medici teams remained exposed for too long, and every recovery party traveled with armed escorts, because Snickrot's red skulls had taught the defenders that even the dead could be bait. Across the districts seized by the orcs, barricades rose from wrecked Imperial armor. Gun pits appeared inside transit terminals. Gretchen hauled ammunition through corridors where human blood still ran between floor plates. Boys dragged ferrocrete slabs into roadblocks, while mechs tore apart captured vehicles and converted them into weapons before their engines had cooled. There was no aftermath, because nothing had ended. There was only a battlefield rearranging itself for the next attack. Armageddon had paid for every kilometer with material it could not quickly replace. Whole regiments existed now only as designations on Munitorum casualty rolls, their surviving companies distributed among formations whose own names would probably disappear before the next campaign review. Vehicle graveyards stretched beyond the Hives in rusting lines, thousands of machines resting where track failure, engine destruction, or ammunition detonation had finally stopped them. Manufactoria still produced shells, track sections, weapon components, and replacement armor, but output had fallen beneath bombardment, sabotage, and power shortages, while demand rose every hour. More ammunition was required to defend less territory. More fuel was required to move fewer operational tanks, because the remaining routes were longer and more dangerous. Servitors worked without rest until joints seized. Engine seers cannibalized machines that would once have been considered repairable, because 3 damaged chimeras might now be required to keep a 4th moving. Above the planet, ships continued to die. Battlefleet Armageddon fought new greenskin arrivals beyond the orbital docks, while wreckage from previous engagements formed fields dense enough to interfere with augur returns. Every tactical success consumed something finite. Every orc loss seemed only to advertise the war to more orcs. Major Ren Varric counted the survivors of the 817th Mechanized Cohort
inside a freight hall whose roof had been half torn away by artillery. He did not count vehicles first. He counted men. 213 reported present, 37 in field medici stations, 21 missing whose status had not been confirmed. The remainder were dead, transferred, trapped behind enemy lines, or reduced to entries a clerk would eventually classify when the correct forms arrived. The cohort had gone to war with thousands. Now men from other shattered Steel Legion units slept among them, their uniforms marked by different regimental numerals beneath the same ash. The remaining armor looked no better. 7 chimeras could move under their own power. 3 more were expected to move once parts arrived. 4 Lehman Ruses remained operational, though one had a turret traverse that failed whenever the hull inclined more than a few degrees. A recovery vehicle had been turned into an ammunition carrier because there were no longer enough wrecks worth recovering near the forward line. Varric read the figures twice, signed the slate, and handed it back to a Munitorum adept. The adept replaced it immediately with another. "Movement orders, Major." Varric stared at him. The adept did not appear to understand why. "Destination? Eastern Manufacturum Corridor. Sector Command requires mechanized reserve elements following reported greenskin concentrations." Varric looked around the hall. A guardsman with half his scalp stitched back into place slept against the track of a chimera. Another man sat nearby cleaning a laser gun, while his left arm ended above the elbow inside fresh bandages. 2 corpsmen were still carrying wounded through the hall toward a field surgical station. When? Immediate redeployment. Varric gave a short laugh that contained no amusement. The adept frowned. "Major?" "Nothing." He signed again. The Imperium did not reward survival. It recycled it. Varric climbed onto the hull of his replacement command chimera and struck the armor twice with his fist. The driver inside looked up through the hatch. "We moving again?" "Yes." "Thought so." "Eastern corridor." The driver swore. Varric ignored him. "Fuel state?" "Enough." "Ammunition?" "Enough if nobody expects miracles." "Nobody does." That was the closest thing the survivors received to a speech. Engines started. Exhaust filled the freight hall. Men who had been asleep less than a minute earlier climbed into troop compartments and checked weapons they had already checked twice. The 817th Mechanized Cohort, or whatever remained that answered to the name, returned to war before many of its wounded had left the previous one. Castor Venn woke beneath white lumen strips aboard an Astartes Medici deck and knew immediately that his armor was gone. He could not feel the familiar pressure of ceramite around his limbs, nor the machine spirit responses at the edge of his senses. Pain reached him instead, filtered through whatever chemical agents the apothecaries had placed in his bloodstream. He looked down and saw reinforced surgical braces along his torso. Several ribs had been replaced or rebuilt. One shoulder was sealed beneath synth flesh and surgical bonding. Metal supports ran along the side where Ghazghkull's claw had compressed his armor into his body. An apothecary stood beside the recovery slab, studying a diagnostic display. "How long?" "Long enough." "Specific." 31 hours. Venn tried to sit. The apothecary placed one hand against his chest and prevented it without effort. "Remain still." "My squad." The apothecary's expression became more severe. Venn waited. "Brother Pelion survived. Brother Cassian survived. Brother Telemachus is undergoing reconstruction." "And the others?" The apothecary did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. Venn closed his eyes. He saw again the perimeter around the crippled repulsor. Ghazghkull advancing through concentrated fire. A Black Templar stepping into the Prophet's path. Brothers firing until magazines emptied. Pelion dragging him backward, while warriors behind them died in sequence to purchase seconds. "How many?" "5 of your immediate formation confirmed dead. Additional losses among supporting squads remain under verification." Venn opened his eyes. "Replacement war gear." The apothecary stared at him. "You cannot wear full plate yet."
When? When your secondary reconstruction accepts load. Estimate. 2 days before partial fitting, longer before combat readiness. Ven absorbed that. Where is Pelion deploying? The apothecary almost smiled. Eastern Hive sectors. Then begin fitting in 2 days. You will still be healing. So will Armageddon. There was no oath of revenge. Ghazghkull did not require one. Hatred would not increase Ven's ammunition capacity, restore dead brothers, or change tactical reality. He had fought the beast, and learned the only lesson that mattered. Ghazghkull could be hurt. Ghazghkull could be delayed. Ghazghkull could not be treated like a champion awaiting single combat. The next time Ven faced him, if there was a next time, he would bring more guns. On the fist of Makraga, Marneus Calgar stood before the hololithic. Representation of Armageddon, and considered an outcome that would have been called victory almost anywhere else. Operation Imperator had prevented immediate collapse of the planetary defense. The Orcs had suffered losses in the millions. Their staging grounds had been destroyed, their formations broken repeatedly, their machines burned across entire regions. Imperial forces still held large portions of Deathmire. Reinforcements continued arriving. The Greenskins had failed to achieve uncontested control of the Hive, and Ghazghkull had succeeded. Calgar enlarged the strategic projection until the planet filled the chamber. New fleet contacts crowded the outer system. Additional Greenskin arrivals confirmed, an Ultramarines officer reported. Multiple warbands, clan composition unresolved. Calgar studied the numbers. Cause? The officer hesitated. There is no single cause. There is. The officer looked toward him. Calgar pointed at Armageddon. Us. The word settled heavily. Every Thunderhawk landing beneath fire became a story. Every chapter badge carved onto armor became proof. Every Titan deployed to the surface told Greenskins elsewhere that Armageddon possessed enemies worthy of Gargants. Every Imperial declaration that the world would never fall increased the value of taking it. Ghazghkull had created a war in which resistance strengthened the reason for further attack. Calgar's expression hardened. Then our task remains unchanged. Deny momentum? Yes. The officer looked at the mass of new contacts. For how long? Calgar did not answer. There were questions even a chapter master could not improve by pretending certainty. Yarrick understood the same nightmare without needing the orbital projections. He understood it because he understood Ghazghkull. He stood inside a secondary command bunker beneath Deathmire, while casualty reports scrolled across one display and intelligence summaries filled another. His body had deteriorated further. Medici personnel had replaced dressings around damaged augmetic interfaces twice. Painkillers dulled the constant ache where machinery met old flesh, but he refused the stronger compounds because they slowed thought. His left leg had lost sensation again. He remained standing anyway, one hand against the edge of the tactical table. An officer nearby said, "Thraka could have committed more force to the heart once the breach was established." Yes. He could also have pursued several withdrawing formations from the western districts. Yes. Why didn't he? Yarrick looked at the map. Because dead enemies do not call for reinforcements. The officer said nothing. Ghazghkull will kill without hesitation. He will spend his own kind in numbers that would destroy a human command structure. He will destroy cities, fleets and worlds if doing so advances the war. Do not mistake that for mindless cruelty. Yarrick's power claw flexed once. It is worse. The officer frowned. He has made cruelty strategic. A world exterminated was finished. A regiment annihilated could no longer hate him. A fortress leveled could no longer demand relief. But a wounded Hive screamed for help. A surviving enemy remembered. A living Yarrick made men stand where another commander might have retreated. And somewhere in the fungal violence of the Orc mind, Ghazghkull had understood that long before many humans had. Makari sat on an ammunition crate while 3 mechs argued about Ghazghkull's left shoulder actuator. One insisted the replacement piston was too small. Another insisted the first mech was too small. The third solved the disagreement by striking the mechanism with a hammer until it moved. Ghazghkull remained standing throughout the repair, towering beneath an improvised gantry in the captured industrial sector beyond Gallows. His armor was more scar than plate now. Imperial blue ceramite fragments had been riveted over one damaged section because a mech had found the material strong. Parts of a Lehman Russ formed reinforcement around another. Mork's Raw had received a new feed assembly made from components taken from 3 different weapons. Gork's Claw still closed imperfectly, producing a grinding sound near full compression that made the mechs unhappy and Ghazghkull indifferent. War bosses filled the chamber around him. Some had lost limbs, others had gained armor. All looked at Ghazghkull differently than they had before Operation Imperator. Makari noticed that. Before, they had feared the prophet. Now they believed him. He had called the angels, and the angels had come. He had wanted bigger battles, and bigger battles had happened. He had walked into their guns, been wounded, and remained alive. Every wound made the story stronger. Every scar became proof. Ghazghkull looked across the assembled bosses. "Deathmire done?" Several orcs laughed. One answered, "We got the heart." Gaz stared at him. The laughter stopped. "That ain't what I asked." The boss swallowed. "No." "Good." The war bosses looked at one another. Ghazghkull stepped from beneath the gantry before the mechs finished tightening the last plate. "Humie's got more tanks?" "Yeah." "More angels?" "Yeah." "More guns?" A Bad Moons boss grinned. "Loads." Ghazghkull's mouth opened into a smile. "Denda war's better." A roar of approval filled the chamber. Gaz raised Gork's Claw. "Any git thinks we won already can leave." Nobody moved. Gaz pointed toward the exit. "Go on." Still nobody moved. Makari grinned. Ghazghkull lowered the claw. "Good. Saves me killing you by the door." The war bosses laughed, because now they were allowed. Orders followed. Wazdaka would take the rebuilt Speedwar toward the eastern industrial routes as soon as Big Reva had fuel. Snickrot had already disappeared into the equatorial jungle, which everyone accepted as the closest thing Snickrot gave to announcing a deployment. Mechs carrying glyph slates spoke of fresh machinery coming from Archimedes' workshops, designs that made several war bosses grin without understanding any of them. New mobs arriving from orbit would be divided between existing fronts rather than gathered into a single concentration. The war would spread. Pressure would remain everywhere. Imperial commanders prepared the opposite movement. Steel Legion armor redeployed. Astartes strike forces received new objectives. Navy vessels changed patrol patterns around the growing Orc fleet. Nothing ended. Later, Ghazghkull walked from the repair gantry into the open air. Armageddon's sky was black with ash. Artillery flashes pulsed along the horizon. Makari followed beneath the great banner. The first orcs to see the prophet began shouting. Then the next mob heard them. Then the next. The sound traveled across the captured district and spilled into trenches, workshops, gun pits, and vehicle parks. Warbikers revved engines. Knobs raised choppers. Gretchen screamed because everyone larger than them was screaming. The roar passed through Vox sets and crude loudspeakers. It crossed Gallows Spaceport. It reached Orc-held districts inside Deathmire. Ships in orbit received it and transmitted it onward. Millions of throats became one voice. Ghazghkull stopped beneath the ash-black sky. He raised Gork's claw. The roar became greater. Far beneath the Hive, inside an Imperial command bunker, whose walls shook with distant bombardment, Yarrick heard it. Nobody needed to tell him what it meant. He stood before the tactical hololith, while fresh greenskin contacts appeared across the system, and listened to the sound of an enemy celebrating a victory that had no territory, no surrender,
and no ending. Neither side had won. Neither side was leaving. Ghazghkull had returned to Armageddon not because he wished to finish the war. He had returned because Armageddon was the one world that understood him. It endured. It hated. It called armies toward itself. It transformed slaughter into legend, and legend into more slaughter. For Ghazghkull, Mag Uruk Thraka, prophet of Gork and Mork, there could be no greater triumph. Armageddon had become exactly what he wanted. War without end.
Thank you, brothers, for watching tonight's Warhammer video. Tonight we had an insane Ghazghkull story. As always, before we get going, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor, and be sure to check out the merch in the description below.
Brothers, the Emperor demands you ready for battle. Reinforce your war gear at lawhammer.store with fresh grimdark apparel, accessories, and collectibles worthy of any loyal servant of the Imperium or agent of chaos. New collections emerge from the warp regularly, with new designs constantly joining the armory. The Emperor protects. Lawhammer provides the gear. Gear up and join the crusade at lawhammer.store.